They went to war before the war reached the ground. Long before front lines formed or beaches were secured, American paratroopers entered combat alone, dropped from the sky into darkness, uncertainty, and enemy territory. There were no friendly lines to fall back on, no guarantee of reinforcement, and no assurance that the mission had even begun successfully. When they hit the ground, the war was already theirs to hold together. This was a new kind of soldier for a new kind of war. Airborne warfare demanded more than courage. It demanded independence, adaptability, and the ability to fight without structure. Paratroopers were trained to land scattered, reorganize instinctively, and move toward objectives without waiting for orders. And every man was expected to lead if necessary, because leadership could be lost in the air just as easily as weapons or radios. The risks were immediate and unforgiving. Aircraft flew low and slow through flak-filled skies. Jump lights flashed, doors opened, and men stepped into darkness with only seconds separating routine from chaos. Drop zones were missed. Equipment was lost. Units landed miles apart. Some paratroopers never made it out of the aircraft. Others landed in trees, flooded fields, or directly among enemy positions. What happened next was never rehearsed. Small groups formed by instinct rather than plan. Ranks mattered less than resolve. Objectives were pursued not because conditions were favorable, but because delay would cost lives elsewhere. Paratroopers fought from the moment they landed, often outnumbered, undersupplied, and uncertain of the larger situation unfolding around them. In North Africa, airborne operations tested the concept under fire. In Sicily, dispersion turned missions into chaos, forcing adaptation at every level. In Normandy, the sky filled with aircraft and tracer fire as entire divisions dropped behind enemy lines to secure causeways, bridges, and road networks critical to the invasion's survival. Those early hours decided everything. Paratroopers blocked reinforcements. They seized crossings. They confused enemy command and control, and they did it without knowing whether the beaches below were holding or failing. As the war continued, airborne forces became instruments of strategic disruption. In the Netherlands, the paratroopers were dropped deep into contested territory to seize bridges and hold them against overwhelming counterattack. In the Ardennes, they were rushed into frozen forests to seal gaps and buy time against armored advances. They were used where speed mattered more than certainty. The conditions were brutal. Paratroopers fought without heavy armor. They held ground with limited artillery. They endured isolation longer than most formations. Supply drops were uncertain. Medical evacuation was delayed. Sleep vanished, casualties mounted. And still, airborne units were expected to hold until relief arrived, not hours later, but days. What defined American paratroopers was not perfection. It was adaptability. Plans failed on contact. Missions evolved instantly. Leadership shifted moment to moment. Success came not from flawless execution, but from resilience under collapse. When units scattered, they reorganized. When objectives were lost, they were taken again. When surrounded, they held. The impact of American paratroopers in World War II cannot be measured solely by territory seized. It must be measured in time. Time denied to the enemy. Time bought for larger forces to arrive. Time that allowed invasions to survive their most vulnerable hours. They were not meant to fight alone forever. They were meant to hold long enough. American paratroopers proved that modern war could be shaped by small units acting independently under extreme pressure. They showed that initiative could replace structure when structure failed, and that discipline could survive chaos. This is not a story of flawless landings or perfect coordination. Nay, it is a story of men who entered the war before it was ready for them, who fought without knowing the outcome, who held the line while the world caught up. This is the story of American paratroopers in World War II, soldiers who fell from the sky into uncertainty and turned disorder into momentum. June 10th, 1940. A conference room at Fort Benning, Georgia sits in uncomfortable silence. 6 Army officers lean forward in wooden chairs, watching grainy newsreel footage flicker across a white wall. The projector chatters in the darkness. On screen, German paratroopers drop from Junkers transport planes over Holland, their parachutes blooming like flowers above Rotterdam's burning skyline. The footage shows men landing on fortress roofs, inside defensive perimeters, behind lines that were supposed to be impregnable. One American colonel exhales slowly, his breath the only sound besides the projector's mechanical rhythm. 3 weeks earlier, these same officers had assured the War Department that airborne assault was an impractical European experiment, unsuitable for American doctrine. Now, they watch European doctrine collapse under the weight of men falling from the sky. The youngest officer in the room, a captain with thick glasses, breaks the silence with 5 words that will reshape American military history. Gentlemen, we have no answer for this. The shock rippling through Fort Benning that summer afternoon was not merely tactical surprise. It was the recognition of institutional blindness. For nearly a decade, American military observers had watched both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany experiment with airborne forces. In 1936, Soviet paratroopers conducted mass drops of over 4,500 men during military exercises. American attachés filed reports describing these demonstrations as interesting but impractical. The assumption was that parachuting soldiers behind enemy lines was a circus stunt, effective perhaps for propaganda but useless in modern warfare. This was not ignorance born from lack of information. It was the more dangerous kind of ignorance, the kind that comes from seeing something revolutionary and dismissing it because it doesn't fit existing doctrine. The German conquest of Belgium's Eben Emael fortress changed everything. On May 10, 1940, 78 German paratroopers landed on top of what was considered the strongest fortress in Europe. Using shaped charges and flamethrowers, they neutralized the position in less than 24 hours. The fortress was designed to withstand artillery bombardment, not men dropping from above. Secretary of War Henry Stimson received the intelligence reports from Europe with mounting alarm. His diary entry from September 19, 1940, captures the anxiety spreading through the War Department. The question is no longer whether airborne forces are viable, but whether we can afford to face an enemy who possesses them while we do not. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, demanded immediate action. The problem was that creating an airborne capability from nothing required solving problems the American military had never confronted. There were no parachutes designed for combat loads. There were no aircraft configured for paratrooper drops. As there were no training protocols, no doctrine manuals, no institutional knowledge. Most fundamentally, there were no soldiers trained to jump out of perfectly functional airplanes while carrying weapons and ammunition. The War Department established the Parachute Test Platoon on June 25, 1940, with a mandate to determine whether American soldiers could do what German and Soviet paratroopers were already demonstrating in combat. They had less than a year to catch up to programs that had been developing for a decade. The man chosen to lead this experimental program was Major William C. Lee, a 47-year-old infantry officer from North Carolina. Lee had never jumped from an airplane. He had never commanded aviation units. His selection was based on something less tangible than technical expertise. He was a true believer. In his first address to the test platoon volunteers, Lee delivered words that would become airborne legend. "We have no history, but we have a rendezvous with destiny." This was not mere rhetoric. Lee understood that he was not simply training soldiers in a new skill. He was creating an entirely new type of warfare, a new military culture, from raw materials of skepticism and improvisation. He faced resistance from every direction. Infantry commanders resented losing good soldiers to what they considered a dangerous experiment. Aviation officers questioned whether transport aircraft should be diverted from other priorities. Budget analysts pointed out the enormous cost of creating specialized equipment and training facilities. Lee's response was to focus on results rather than permission. He would prove the concept worked, then fight the institutional battles. The parachute test platoon began with 48 volunteers from the 29th Infantry Regiment. These were not special operations soldiers selected through rigorous screening, because no such screening process existed yet. They were ordinary infantrymen who responded to a notice posted on a barracks bulletin board. Volunteers wanted for parachute testing duty, hazardous duty, extra pay. The notice didn't specify how much extra pay because that hadn't been determined yet. It didn't outline the training program because no training program existed. It promised only that the duty would be hazardous. 48 men stepped forward anyway, driven by boredom with garrison duty, the attraction to adventure, or simply curiosity about whether a human being could actually jump from a plane and survive. Among them was Private William T. Ryder, a former high school athlete from Pennsylvania, who later explained his motivation with characteristic understatement. They said most men would be too scared to try it. I wanted to know if I was scared or not. This self-selection process, choosing men precisely because they were drawn to what others feared, would define airborne culture for generations. The first test jumps were exercises in controlled terror. On August 16, 1940, the test platoon conducted its first formation jump at Lawson Field, Fort Benning. The aircraft was a Douglas B-18 bomber, modified with a crude exit door. The parachutes were T-4 models. IC borrowed from Air Corps emergency equipment and never tested for intentional tactical jumps. The jump altitude was 1,500 feet, which gave approximately 30 seconds of descent time. If the parachute failed to open properly, there was insufficient time to deploy a reserve. No reserves existed anyway. Private Aubrey Eberhart was the first man to exit the aircraft. His parachute opened with a violent jerk that later testing would measure at approximately 9 Gs of force. He landed hard, rolled badly, and fractured his ankle. The second jumper broke his leg. By the end of that first day, 5 of the 48 men were injured badly enough to require hospitalization. The remaining 43 were ordered to jump again the next morning. This was the crucible. Men who had jumped once and watched their friends carried off on stretchers had to decide whether to jump again. 37 did. Those who refused were returned to their original units without prejudice, but without the right to wear jump wings that didn't exist yet anyway. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had developed airborne forces through systematic military planning over years. The United States was trying to compress that development into months through sheer willpower and acceptance of casualties. Throughout the fall of 1940, the test platoon jumped again and again, each iteration revealing new problems. Parachutes designed for emergency bailout opened too violently for men carrying combat loads. Equipment strapped to soldiers' bodies broke on landing impact. The modified bombers could carry only a handful of paratroopers, making mass tactical drops impossible. Navigation at night was so imprecise that drops often landed miles from intended zones, even in training. The injury rate was unsustainable. In the first 6 months, 37% of jumpers sustained injuries requiring medical treatment. Some were minor sprains and contusions. Others were career-ending, shattered vertebrae, and compound fractures. The medical staff at Fort Benning began referring to the test platoon as the Orthopedic Research Division. Yet the volunteers kept jumping because Lee had convinced them they were not just testing equipment, but proving that American soldiers could master what German paratroopers had already achieved. By January 1941, the test platoon had grown to a full battalion, then to a regiment. The War Department authorized the formation of the 1st Parachute Infantry Regiment, the 501st, with Lee promoted to colonel as its commander. The institutional skepticism began to crack. If these men could survive the training, perhaps they could survive combat. If they could land accurately in daylight over friendly territory, perhaps they could eventually land at night over enemy positions. Perhaps the United States could field an airborne force after all. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Germany had used paratroopers to seize critical objectives in Norway, Holland, and Belgium with stunning effect, but those operations had also revealed terrible vulnerabilities. In the invasion of Crete in May 1941, German paratroopers suffered over 50% casualties in the first day of fighting. Adolf Hitler was so shocked by the losses that he forbade future large-scale airborne operations. The American observers studying Crete faced a troubling conclusion. Airborne assault could work, but the cost might be prohibitively high. The program expanded anyway, driven by strategic necessity and the momentum of true believers like Lee. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States had trained approximately 2,000 paratroopers. Germany had over 20,000 combat-experienced airborne soldiers. The gap was enormous, but at least it was no longer infinite. The question was no longer whether American soldiers could jump from planes, but whether they could do so in sufficient numbers. With adequate equipment. to make a strategic difference in a global war. Fort Benning became a factory of paratroopers, churning out volunteers who made their 5 qualifying jumps and received their silver wings in ceremonies that were already becoming legendary. The wings themselves were designed by Lieutenant William Yarborough, who sketched them one evening in his quarters, a parachute flanked by wings, symbolizing the marriage of infantry and aviation. Men who earned those wings wore them with fierce pride, a visible mark that separated them from regular infantry. The mystique was already forming, the sense that paratroopers were different, elite, chosen. Yet beneath the growing confidence, the fundamental tension remained unresolved. American military doctrine had no clear answer for how to employ airborne forces in actual combat. Were they raiders, striking behind enemy lines and withdrawing before enemy forces could respond? Were they assault troops, seizing key terrain and holding until relieved by conventional forces? Were they a strategic surprise weapon to be held in reserve for the decisive moment? The Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. The German doctrine, before Crete, had emphasized surprise assault on fortified positions. The American doctrine was still being written by men who had never seen airborne combat, based on training exercises conducted over friendly territory, with no enemy shooting back. The paratroopers at Fort Benning were learning to exit aircraft, control their descent, and land without breaking bones. They were not yet learning how to land under fire, assemble scattered units in darkness, or fight their way to objectives against prepared defenses. Those lessons would have to be learned in combat, and the tuition would be paid in blood. The volunteers of 1940 and 1941 had answered the first question. American soldiers could jump from planes. The war would answer the harder question, whether they should. October 7, 1940, Fort Benning, Georgia. Private William T. Ryder sits across a desk from Major William C. Lee, trying not to fidget. The interview has lasted 10 minutes, and Lee has said almost nothing, just watched Ryder with the patient intensity of a man evaluating horseflesh. Finally, Lee speaks. Son, why do you want to jump out of airplanes? Ryder gives the answer he's been rehearsing, something about service, duty, trying something new. Lee cuts him off with a wave. That's what you think I want to hear. Tell me the real reason. The silence stretches long enough that Ryder can hear typewriters clacking in the outer office. Then he tells the truth. Because they said most men would be too scared, sir. I want to know if I'm scared or not. Lee's expression doesn't change, but he makes a notation on Ryder's file. Honest answer, you'll do. Ryder leaves not knowing whether he's passed or failed, only that he's said something true. 3 days later, he receives orders to report to the parachute test platoon. He will make his first jump in 2 weeks. He will survive the war. And 40 years later, he will tell an interviewer that sitting in that office, not knowing if he had the courage to jump, was more frightening than anything he experienced in combat. The men who volunteered for paratrooper duty in 1940 and 1941 were a self-selecting population shaped by specific incentives and psychological drives. The financial incentive was real, but not overwhelming. $50 per month jump pay, added to base pay of $21 per month for a private. This represented more than a 100% pay increase, enough to send money home to struggling families or save for post-war plans. But the hazard was proportionally large. In the first year of the program, the injury rate in training exceeded 30%. Roughly 1 in 3 volunteers sustained an injury serious enough to require medical treatment. Some of those injuries ended military careers before they truly began. The men who volunteered knew these statistics, or could observe the evidence walking through Fort Benning on crutches. They volunteered anyway, which suggested motivations beyond money. Psychologists who later studied airborne volunteers identified common traits: above average physical confidence, tolerance for risk, need for peer recognition, desire to prove oneself against a visible standard. These were not kamikaze pilots seeking death. They were young men seeking a definitive answer to the question of their own courage. The physical requirements were stringent but not impossible. Age between 21 and 32. Height minimum 5 feet 6 inches, maximum 6 feet 2 inches. Weight maximum 185 pounds. Vision 20/20 in both eyes without correction. No history of broken bones, heart conditions, or psychological treatment. These standards eliminated roughly half of potential applicants immediately. The medical examinations were intrusive and thorough. Doctors checked reflexes, balance, depth perception, tolerance for heights. They asked about childhood fears, family history of mental illness, recurring nightmares. They were trying to identify not just physical weakness, but psychological fragility, men who might freeze in the door of the aircraft or panic under the canopy. The screening was imperfect. Some men who passed every test still washed out in training when confronted with the reality of stepping into empty air. Others who seemed marginal in testing proved fearless when the moment came. The human mind's response to mortal fear could not be predicted with complete accuracy, only approximated through observation and intuition. The cultural markers of paratrooper identity emerged immediately and organically. The Corcoran jump boots were the most visible sign. These were modified service boots with higher ankle support, extra lacing, and reinforced leather designed to cushion landing impact. They were also expensive and difficult to obtain, which made them valuable. Paratroopers wore them everywhere, on duty and off. Blouse trousers tucked into the tops in a style that was technically against regulation, but universally tolerated. When paratroopers walked into bars in Columbus, Georgia, or Fayetteville, North Carolina, the boots identified them before they spoke a word. This created tension with regular infantry soldiers who saw the paratroopers as arrogant glory seekers, getting extra pay for what amounted to circus tricks. Yet the term suicide troops was originally an insult coined by line infantry, suggesting the paratroopers were too stupid or reckless to recognize the futility of their mission. The paratroopers adopted the term as a badge of honor because they understood something the critics did not. Elite identity requires external opposition. Being despised by regular infantry proved they were different, special, worth more. The brawls were inevitable and frequent. Saturday nights in Columbus saw paratroopers and regular infantry clashing in bars, back alleys, and occasionally on the main street itself. The military police learned to recognize the pattern. Paratroopers would enter an establishment wearing their distinctive boots, order drinks, and make sure everyone noticed they were paratroopers. While regular infantry soldiers would make comments about jump school dropouts or $50 heroes. Someone would throw a punch. Reinforcements from both sides would pour in. The MPs would eventually restore order and haul both groups back to base, where they would receive lectures about conduct unbecoming and return to the same bars the following weekend. This was not meaningless violence. It was the physical enforcement of social boundaries, the establishment of hierarchy through combat. The paratroopers needed to prove they were tougher than regular infantry, not just different. The fights served that purpose more effectively than any official designation could. Major Lee tolerated the brawls within reason, all understanding that men who would fight other American soldiers over an insult would probably fight enemy soldiers with equal fervor. The training attrition rate was brutal by design. Of every 100 men who began paratrooper training, only 65 completed it. The washout rate increased during jump week, when theory became reality. The 34-foot towers were intimidating but manageable, a high platform from which men jumped, wearing a harness attached to a cable, simulating the parachute opening shock and teaching proper landing technique. The 250-foot towers were different. These had been purchased from the 1939 New York World's Fair, where they had operated as a civilian amusement ride. At Fort Benning, they became instruments of psychological testing. As men were lifted to the top in an open parachute, then released to descend in a controlled fall. At 250 feet, the ground looked very far away. The descent took long enough that fear had time to build. Some men who had sailed through every other aspect of training froze on the tower, unable to release themselves. They were quietly returned to regular units. No shame attached officially, but everyone knew. The men who continued wore their completion like armor against doubt. The fifth and final qualifying jump was the watershed moment. The first 4 jumps were conducted in daylight, from low altitude, over clearly marked drop zones with medics standing by. The 5th jump was different. It was conducted with full combat equipment, rifle, ammunition, pack, helmet. The additional weight changed everything. Exit velocity increased. Parachute opening shock was more violent. Landing impact was harder. Men who had landed smoothly on previous jumps found themselves hitting the ground with stunning force. The breath knocked from their lungs, equipment digging into their bodies. Some broke bones on that fifth jump and had to recycle through training after healing. Others completed it and realized with sudden clarity that they had just experienced a controlled version of what combat jumps would be like. The difference was that in combat, people would be shooting at them during descent. That realization separated the men who viewed paratrooper training as adventure from those who understood it as preparation for probable death. Both groups received their wings, but they wore them with different knowledge. The wings ceremony was simple and powerful. The silver parachutist badge, designed by Lieutenant Yarborough, was pinned to the soldier's uniform over the left breast pocket. No speech was given. No oath was required. The act of pinning the badge was sufficient recognition that the soldier had done something most men could not or would not do. Some commanders use the blood wings tradition, pounding the pins through the uniform and into the soldier's chest hard enough to draw blood. This was never official policy, but it was widespread enough to be considered traditional. The pain was brief and welcome, a physical mark to accompany the visible badge. The newly qualified paratrooper would leave the ceremony with small spots of blood seeping through his uniform and a sense that he had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. He was no longer whatever he had been before. He was a paratrooper, a member of a brotherhood defined by shared risk and mutual contempt for those who had not taken that risk. The demographic composition of early paratrooper units reflected both opportunity and exclusion. The volunteer force was overwhelmingly white, not because black soldiers lacked courage, but because the Army maintained racial segregation. The first black paratrooper unit, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, was not formed until late 1943, 3 years after the first white units. This was not an oversight, but a policy decision based on the racist assumption that black soldiers lacked the initiative and intelligence for complex airborne operations. When the 555th finally formed and trained to the same standards as white units, they proved that assumption was false, but by then hundreds of black soldiers who wanted to volunteer had been denied the opportunity. The paratroopers who landed at Normandy and Holland were almost entirely white, not because they were the only Americans willing to jump, but because they were the only Americans allowed to. This historical reality complicates the narrative of airborne exceptionalism. The volunteers were exceptional within the population permitted to volunteer, which was not the same as the entire population. The culture that emerged from this selection process was simultaneously admirable and troubling. The paratroopers developed fierce unit loyalty, physical courage, and tactical initiative that would prove valuable in combat. They also developed arrogance that sometimes crossed into recklessness, contempt for authority that occasionally undermined discipline, and an us versus them mentality that created friction with supporting units. Truck drivers, cooks, headquarters clerks, anyone who wore a uniform but lacked jump wings was considered inferior. This attitude would cause problems throughout the war, as paratroopers refused to follow orders from non-airborne officers, started fights with support personnel, and generally acted as if their wings exempted them from normal military courtesy. Commanders struggled to balance the aggressive confidence that made paratroopers effective in combat with the subordination required for military operations. Some decided the trade-off was worth it. Others concluded that paratroopers were more trouble than they were worth. Both were probably right. By December 1941, the United States had approximately 2,000 qualified paratroopers organized into the 501st and 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiments. They had proven that American soldiers could master the technical skills of airborne operations. They had created a distinctive culture and identity. They had convinced the War Department to invest in specialized equipment, dedicated aircraft, and expanded training facilities. What they had not done was jump into combat. All the training, all the injuries, all the bravado remained theoretical until tested against an enemy who would shoot back. The volunteers of 1940 and 1941 had answered Lee's question about whether they were scared. Most had discovered they were scared but willing, which was the only courage that mattered. The question now was whether that courage would be sufficient when they stepped out of aircraft over hostile territory, far from home, with no way back except through enemy lines or death. The war would answer that question in a series of blood lessons that no training could prepare them for. September 23, 1940, Fort Benning, Georgia. Private James Howell exits the Douglas B-18 at 1,500 feet, his third jump. The parachute opens with the familiar violent jerk that still feels like being hit by a car. Then something goes wrong. Instead of the smooth descent he experienced on his previous jumps, he's oscillating wildly. The canopy above him partially collapsed on one side. The ground rushes up faster than it should. Howell has time to think three distinct thoughts. This is going to hurt. I should have joined the Navy, and I wonder if this is how I die. He hits the Georgia red clay at roughly 25 feet per second. Wrong angle, wrong position, both legs absorbing the full impact. The sound of his tibias breaking is loud enough that men standing 50 yards away will later report hearing it. Howell lies in the dirt, trying not to scream, looking up at the sky, watching other parachutes descend in lazy spirals. Two of those parachutes will land on jumpers, who also break bones today. By sunset, the parachute test platoon will have 3 men in the hospital and a crisis meeting scheduled to determine whether the program should continue. The injury statistics from the first 6 months of airborne training were unsustainable for any program hoping to expand beyond a small test unit. Of the first 48 volunteers, 18 sustained injuries serious enough to require hospitalization. That represented a 37% casualty rate without ever encountering enemy fire. Simple mathematics demonstrated the problem. If 1/3 of paratroopers were injured in training, and training required an average of 5 qualifying jumps, then scaling up to divisions of thousands of men would require accepting hundreds of training casualties. The medical staff at Fort Benning documented the injury patterns with clinical precision. Fractured ankles and lower legs accounted for 42% of injuries. Spinal compression injuries were 23%. Shoulder and arm fractures from improper landing technique were 19%. The remaining 16% was a miscellany of contusions, sprains, and what the doctors euphemistically called psychological discontinuation, men who froze in the aircraft door or refused to jump again after one terrifying descent. The pattern was clear. Soldiers were hitting the ground wrong, with techniques borrowed from circus parachutists and civilian jumpers who descended much more slowly with different equipment. The solution came from an unlikely source. Captain William T. Ryder, the former private who had impressed Lee with his honest answer about fear, noticed something during a conversation with a Navy flight surgeon. Emergency parachutes used by naval aviators had different descent characteristics than the T-4 parachutes used by paratroopers. Aviator parachutes prioritized gentle descent for emergency bailout. The paratrooper parachutes were designed to get men to the ground quickly to minimize time under fire. The result was a landing speed of 18 to 22 feet per second, equivalent to jumping off a 12-foot wall. No amount of bending the knees would safely absorb that impact if the jumper landed flat-footed. Ryder began experimenting with rolling techniques, using his body to distribute the landing force across legs, hip, back, and shoulder in a continuous motion. He broke a rib perfecting the technique. But when he showed it to other instructors, they recognized immediately that he had solved a problem that had seemed insurmountable. The technique would eventually be formalized as the Parachute Landing Fall, the PLF, taught to every American paratrooper for the next 80 years. And the PLF was conceptually simple and physically difficult. Upon landing, the paratrooper would keep his feet and knees together, knees slightly bent. At the moment of impact, he would fall to his side, rolling across 5 points of contact: balls of feet, calf, thigh, hip, and back. This distributed the landing force across a much larger area and transformed downward momentum into rotational energy. When executed properly, a paratrooper could land from a T-5 parachute without injury, even on hard ground. When executed poorly, the paratrooper would still hit the ground at 20 feet per second, but now with angular momentum that could drive his head into the dirt or twist his spine. The training focused on repetition until the motion became automatic. Soldiers practiced from 1-foot platforms, then 3-foot, then 6-foot, learning to roll without thinking. They practiced in full equipment, with rifles, with their eyes closed. The goal was to make the technique so deeply ingrained that it would happen even when the paratrooper was terrified, disoriented, or under fire. The jump towers became the proving ground for refined technique. Fort Benning had installed two types of towers by early 1941. The 34-foot towers were freestanding platforms from which soldiers jumped, wearing harnesses attached to a pulley system. These simulated the parachute opening shock and allowed instructors to observe exit technique, body position during descent, and landing mechanics. The 250-foot towers were far more dramatic. Purchased from the 1939 New York World's Fair, where they had operated as the parachute jump ride, these towers lifted soldiers to a height where they could actually experience several seconds of real parachute descent. The soldier would be lifted in an open parachute attached to a cable, then released to descend in a controlled fall. The towers were visible for miles, dominating the Fort Benning skyline, a constant reminder to every soldier on base that something unusual was happening at the parachute school. They were also terrifying to anyone with normal fear responses, which was exactly their purpose. The towers separated men who could control their fear from men who could not. The training evolution became more sophisticated as the program expanded. By mid-1941, the parachute school had developed a structured 5-week course divided into specific phases. In Ground Week focused on physical conditioning and basic exit technique, using mock aircraft doors built at ground level. Soldiers would practice the exit motion hundreds of times, stand in the door, hands on the static line, jump out and up to clear the aircraft, maintain tight body position. The motion had to be perfect before anyone went near an actual aircraft. Tower Week introduced the platforms and cables, adding the dimension of height and the physical sensation of a parachute opening. The 34-foot towers were challenging. The 250-foot towers were revelatory, the first time most soldiers experienced actual fear during training. Some men stood on the tower platform, looked down, and quietly informed the instructor they were finished. They were returned to regular infantry units without ceremony. The men who descended from the towers entered Jump Week with knowledge that they could function while afraid. Jump Week was the culmination and the test. 5 jumps from a C-47 aircraft, increasing in complexity. The first jump was static line, mass exit, daylight, no equipment. Just the soldier, his main parachute, and the knowledge that this was real, that if something went wrong, there was no cable to catch him. The aircraft would climb to 1,500 feet. The jump master would hook static lines to the anchor cable. The door would open to rushing wind and empty air, and each soldier would shuffle forward, knowing he was about to do something that violated every survival instinct evolution had bred into humans. The second and third jumps were similar, building confidence through repetition. On the fourth jump, added equipment: weapon, pack, helmet. This was when soldiers learned that carrying 60 pounds of gear fundamentally changed the jump experience. Exit velocity increased. Opening shock was more violent. Landing impact was significantly harder. Men who had landed smoothly on earlier jumps found themselves slamming into the ground with jarring force. The fifth jump was with full combat load at night. In darkness, the ground was invisible. Soldiers had to rely on timing and sense of motion to prepare for landing. Some misjudged and hit unprepared. The injury rate on the fifth jump was consistently higher than the others, but it was also the necessary preparation for combat. Combat jumps would be at night, with full equipment, probably under fire. The fifth jump was the closest training could come to that reality. The equipment itself remained problematic despite continuous refinement. The T-5 parachute, adopted in 1941, was an improvement over the earlier T-4, but still had significant limitations. It was a 28-foot diameter canopy with 15 suspension lines made of nylon, packed in a backpack-style container with a static line deployment system. The static line, attached to a cable in the aircraft, would pull the parachute from the pack as the soldier fell away from the plane. In theory, the parachute would deploy within 2 to 3 seconds and be fully inflated within 4 to 5 seconds. In practice, malfunctions occurred in approximately 1 out of every 1,000 jumps. The main canopy might fail to deploy, or deploy partially, or become tangled in the suspension lines. For these situations, paratroopers carried a reserve parachute on their chest, but deploying the reserve required clear thinking and functional hands during what was probably the most stressful moment of a soldier's life. Some men who experienced main parachute failures managed to deploy their reserves successfully. Others did not, and their deaths contributed to the growing roster of training fatalities that the program tried to minimize but could not eliminate entirely. The psychological impact of training fatalities on other soldiers was complex and contradictory. Every death proved that paratrooper training was genuinely dangerous, which reinforced the elite status of men who completed it. But deaths also raised questions about whether the program was worth the human cost even before combat began. When Private Eugene Sheeran became entangled in his static line during a training jump in August 1942 and hung beneath the aircraft for several terrifying minutes before being pulled back inside, he became simultaneously a legend and a warning. His survival was celebrated. The fact that he came within seconds of death was carefully not discussed. The incident was investigated. New procedures were implemented to reduce the chance of static line entanglement, and training continued. This pattern repeated with each serious accident: investigation, procedural adjustment, continuation. The underlying acceptance was that some men would die in training just as some men would die in combat. The goal was to minimize training deaths while still preparing soldiers for combat reality. That balance was never perfect and often failed, but it was the only way to reconcile elite training with acceptable casualty rates. By the end of 1941, the parachute school at Fort Benning had processed over 3,000 soldiers, qualifying approximately 2,000 of them as paratroopers. The training program had evolved from experimental improvisation to systematic instruction. The injury rate, while still high by normal standards, had decreased from 37% to roughly 15% as techniques improved. The psychological understanding of what made an effective paratrooper had deepened. Instructors could identify men likely to freeze or panic with increasing accuracy during the tower phase before those men boarded actual aircraft. The culture of airborne training had solidified into traditions and rhythms that would persist for decades. The emphasis on physical fitness, the tolerance for controlled aggression, the pride in doing what most men could not or would not do. What remained unknown was how these training ground skills would translate to combat. The difference between jumping over Georgia and jumping over Normandy was the difference between simulation and reality, and that difference could not be taught, only experienced and survived. March 15, 1941, Wright Field, Ohio. An engineering team huddles against the cold, watching a weighted dummy fall from a C-47 at 3,000 feet. The dummy is strapped with a reproduction M1 rifle in a leather scabbard designed to attach to the paratrooper's leg. This is the sixth test drop today. The previous 5 scabbards broke on impact, sending the rifle tumbling away across the test range. The parachute deploys normally. The dummy descends, impact. The scabbard breaks again, leather straps tearing away, the rifle cartwheeling into the distance. An engineer marks the failure in his notebook, the 6th hash mark in a row. The contract specified that the scabbard should survive 90% of drops. So far, survival rate is 0%. The engineer knows that paratroopers will start combat training with these scabbards in 6 weeks. He knows that men jumping into Sicily or France with broken scabbards will land unarmed, surrounded by enemies, with their rifles lying somewhere in the dark. He closes his notebook and walks toward the warm truck without a solution. The equipment problems facing American airborne forces in 1941 and 42 were not minor technical difficulties, but fundamental design failures that would directly cost lives in combat. The M1 Garand rifle, standard infantry weapon, weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. Adding a bayonet, sling, and cleaning kit brought total weight to roughly 11 pounds. A paratrooper descending at 20 feet per second with 11 pounds of steel and wood strapped to his leg experienced impact forces that no existing scabbard could reliably contain. The engineering challenge was to create a mounting system that would protect the rifle during descent and landing, remain securely attached to the soldier's body, but also allow quick detachment so the soldier could assume a fighting position immediately after landing. These requirements were contradictory. A system strong enough to survive impact was too complex for quick release. A system simple enough for combat use was too weak to survive descent. The engineers at Wright Field tested dozens of designs throughout 1941. None worked reliably. Production contracts were issued anyway, because the training schedule demanded equipment, even if that equipment was inadequate. The parachute harness itself underwent continuous revision without achieving satisfactory resolution. The T4 harness used in early training was adapted from emergency aviation parachutes, designed for one-time use by pilots abandoning aircraft. It worked adequately for that purpose. It was inadequate for combat paratroopers who needed to carry weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, explosives, and personal items. The total load for a fully equipped paratrooper often exceeded 100 pounds in addition to body weight. This created multiple problems. First, the additional weight dramatically increased descent speed and landing impact. Second, the weight had to be distributed on the harness in ways that wouldn't entangle with the parachute during deployment or strangle the paratrooper during descent. Third, the equipment had to be arranged so the soldier could actually fight after landing, not spend precious minutes unbuckling gear while under fire. The T7 harness, introduced in 1942, addressed some issues while creating others. It had a quick-release system that allowed shedding the main parachute rapidly after landing. The quick-release mechanism occasionally activated during descent, even dropping soldiers from the sky with no parachute. Private Eugene Sheeran's near-death experience in August 1942 illuminated a different equipment failure. The static line system that deployed parachutes automatically as soldiers exited the aircraft required that each paratrooper hook a metal clip to an anchor cable running the length of the C-47. After exiting, the static line would pull the parachute from its pack, then separate, allowing the paratrooper to descend free. The system worked reliably in controlled conditions. In the chaos of mass exits with heavily laden soldiers moving quickly through a confined space, static lines sometimes became tangled around soldiers' bodies. Sheeran had exited the aircraft normally, but somehow the static line had wrapped around his leg. Instead of deploying his parachute, the line held him suspended beneath the aircraft, unable to deploy his reserve because the main parachute was still packed. He hung there for approximately 7 minutes while the pilot circled, and the jump master, Staff Sergeant Ernest "The Rock" Martinez, climbed out on the aircraft's exterior to pull Sheeran back inside. Martinez received a commendation. Sheeran received psychological counseling and permission to never jump again. The incident report recommended additional static line training and more careful exit procedures. It did not recommend redesigning the static line system because no better system existed. The equipment container problem was never satisfactorily solved throughout the war. Paratroopers needed to carry heavy equipment that could not be strapped to their bodies: machine guns, mortars, ammunition crates, old radio sets, medical supplies. The initial solution was the Griswold bag, a canvas container that could be attached to the parachute harness and released to dangle below the paratrooper on a 15-foot rope during descent. In theory, the bag would hit the ground first, absorbing some impact and allowing the paratrooper to land more lightly. In practice, the bags frequently tore loose during parachute deployment or descent, sending expensive equipment tumbling away. A study conducted before the Sicily invasion found that approximately 30% of Griswold bags separated from their paratroopers during descent and training jumps. The equipment was simply lost, scattered across the countryside. In combat, this meant machine gun crews landing without their weapons, radio operators without radios, medics without medical supplies. These alternative systems were tested continuously. The leg bag, which attached to the paratrooper's leg and could be lowered on a shorter rope just before landing, had a better retention rate, but was limited to 20 pounds. Heavier items still required the Griswold bag, with its persistent failure rate. The reserve parachute question created fierce debate within the airborne community. In civilian skydiving and military pilot training, reserve parachutes were standard equipment, an emergency backup if the main parachute failed. For combat paratroopers, reserves created a dilemma. A reserve parachute added approximately 20 pounds of weight, took up space on the soldier's chest that could be used for ammunition or grenades, and statistically would be needed in less than 1% of jumps. In training, and where jumps occurred in daylight over clear drop zones with medical support standing by, the reserve made sense. In combat, where every pound mattered and paratroopers were already overloaded with equipment, some commanders questioned whether reserves were worth the trade-off. The debate was settled by the first combat fatality from parachute malfunction. A soldier whose main parachute failed and who had no reserve became a falling casualty that haunted every subsequent discussion. Reserves became mandatory equipment despite the weight penalty. This decision saved lives, but it also meant that every paratrooper carried 20 pounds of equipment that would likely never be used, reducing the ammunition and supplies he could carry into combat. The weapons load problem was never fully solved, only mitigated through compromise. The paratroopers needed individual weapons for self-defense immediately upon landing, crew-served weapons for sustained combat, and enough ammunition to fight until resupplied. The contradictory requirements created impossible choices. A paratrooper who jumped with his M1 rifle assembled and ready could fight immediately upon landing, but risked the rifle breaking loose during descent. A paratrooper who broke his rifle down into components and packed them securely would land with an intact weapon but need several minutes to reassemble it while exposed and vulnerable. The solution adopted for most combat jumps was to carry the rifle in a padded scabbard or bag attached to the leg, a compromise that partially protected the weapon while allowing relatively quick access. The compromise satisfied no one fully, but was better than the alternatives. Submachine guns, lighter and more compact than rifles, became popular among paratroopers, specifically because they were easier to carry during jumps. The Thompson submachine gun weighed 10 pounds loaded, could be broken down quickly, and was devastatingly effective at close range. Many paratroopers traded their issued rifles for Thompsons obtained through official channels or less official means. The weapons sergeants learned not to ask too many questions about serial numbers. The testing regime for airborne equipment was both extensive and inadequate. Extensive in that every piece of gear was tested repeatedly under various conditions. Different altitudes, different weights, different weather conditions, different aircraft speeds. And inadequate in that no amount of testing could truly replicate combat conditions. Test dummies didn't experience fear, didn't make the mistakes that terrified soldiers made, didn't have to function under fire after landing. The engineers did their best to predict failure modes and design around them. They succeeded in making equipment that worked most of the time. Most of the time was not good enough when the remaining percentage represented dead soldiers, but it was the best that industrial capability and timeline constraints allowed. The men who would jump into Sicily carried equipment that was better than what the test platoon had used in 1940, worse than what later generations of paratroopers would carry, and fundamentally experimental. They would be testing equipment in combat that had never been fully tested in peace. The parachute malfunction rate of approximately 1 in 1,000 jumps recorded in training was considered acceptable by military standards, if not by the standards of the men under those parachutes. Translated into operational terms, it meant that a regiment of 2,000 paratroopers making a combat jump could expect 2 complete parachute failures. 2 men would exit the aircraft, their main parachutes would fail to deploy or deploy incorrectly, and they would have approximately 5 seconds to recognize the malfunction and deploy their reserves before impact. In training, with instructors watching, in daylight, over familiar drop zones, some men successfully deployed reserves after main parachute failures. In combat, at night, under fire, heavily loaded with equipment, the success rate would be lower. The airborne commanders knew this. The soldiers knew this. The knowledge was not discussed frequently, but was always present. A background radiation of dread that colored every jump. The men who hooked their static lines and shuffled toward the door knew that for approximately 2 of them, the next 60 seconds would be their last. They didn't know which 2. Neither did anyone else. That uncertainty was part of what made them paratroopers. By the time of the Sicily invasion in July 1943, American paratroopers were jumping with equipment that represented the best industrial capability of the period, which was not saying much. They carried T5 parachutes with known flaws. They wore T7 harnesses with quick-release systems that sometimes released too quickly. They carried weapons in scabbards that broke roughly 40% of the time on hard landings. They used Griswold bags that separated from their bodies 30% of the time. They wore boots designed for impact absorption that helped significantly, but couldn't fully compensate for 20 foot per second landing speeds. They jumped with the knowledge that their equipment had been tested but not perfected, improved but not solved, modified continuously without achieving reliability. The equipment crisis was not a single dramatic failure, but a systematic inadequacy that forced paratroopers to compensate through skill, luck, and acceptance of casualties. The men adapted because they had no choice. The alternative was not jumping at all, which would have meant returning to regular infantry and admitting that all the training, all the injuries, all the risk had been for nothing. They jumped with inadequate equipment because inadequate equipment was better than no airborne capability at all. The cost of that decision would be calculated in Sicily, in Normandy, in Holland, in Belgium, in bodies that landed wrong, in weapons that broke, in equipment that scattered, in missions that failed because the tools were not adequate to the task. The equipment crisis persisted throughout the war, never fully resolved, always present as an additional enemy that killed men as reliably as German bullets. June 18, 1942. Combined Chiefs of Staff Conference Room, London. Major General Frederick Boy Browning stands before a wall-sized map of Europe, pointer in hand. In describing the theoretical capabilities of airborne forces to an audience of American and British officers who look increasingly skeptical, Browning, commander of British airborne forces, speaks with the confidence of a man who has never jumped into combat. Gentlemen, imagine 15,000 men, fully equipped, delivered 300 miles behind enemy lines in under 6 hours. No coastal defenses to breach, no artillery to suppress. Simply men appearing where the enemy least expects them, seizing critical infrastructure before defenders can respond. He taps the map at various points: bridges, airfields, communication centers. An American colonel raises his hand. General Browning, the Germans tried exactly this at Crete. They suffered 70% casualties in the first day. Hitler forbade them from ever doing it again. Why should we expect different results? Browning pauses, his pointer hovering over the Mediterranean. Because, Colonel, we will learn from German mistakes. We will refine the doctrine. We will execute with greater precision. The American colonel writes something in his notebook and underlines it twice. Later, someone will ask what he wrote. The answer, theory unproven, costs likely catastrophic. The strategic theory behind airborne forces was seductive in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Traditional military advances moved at the speed of marching men, limited by logistics, terrain, and the need to defeat enemy forces sequentially. Airborne assault promised to bypass all of that, projecting combat power directly to critical objectives deep in enemy territory. The theoretical advantages were obvious. A single airborne division, properly employed, could seize bridges that would otherwise require weeks of conventional advance to reach. They could capture airfields, allowing follow-on forces to land reinforcements and supplies. They could cut enemy communications, creating chaos in rear areas, forcing the enemy to divert forces from the front to deal with threats appearing behind them. They could hold key terrain until relieved by advancing friendly forces, collapsing enemy defensive lines from the inside. On paper, with assumptions of perfect execution, airborne forces were a war-winning capability that could fundamentally alter the pace and nature of warfare. The problem was that warfare never proceeded according to theory, and the gap between theoretical potential and operational reality was measured in dead soldiers. The Soviet Union had pioneered large-scale airborne doctrine in the 1930s, conducting exercises that dropped thousands of paratroopers in coordinated operations designed to exploit breakthroughs created by conventional forces. American military observers who witnessed these exercises filed reports that were simultaneously impressed and dismissive. Impressed by the logistical complexity of moving thousands of men by air and landing them with reasonable accuracy. Dismissive because the exercises were conducted under idealized conditions: friendly territory, no enemy fire, clear weather, unlimited time to assemble and organize after landing. The observers noted correctly that combat conditions would be dramatically different. They concluded incorrectly that this made airborne operations impractical for actual warfare. The assumption was that the additional complexity and risk would outweigh the potential advantages. This assumption persisted until German Fallschirmjäger proved it catastrophically wrong in Holland and Belgium in May 1940. The German success forced a complete reassessment of airborne potential, but the reassessment was complicated by subsequent German failure at Crete, which suggested that the doctrine had fatal flaws after all. The Crete operation in May 1941 became the cautionary tale that haunted every subsequent airborne planning session. German paratroopers and glider troops assaulted the island with approximately 22,000 men in the largest airborne operation conducted to that point. They achieved complete tactical surprise. They landed on or near most of their objectives. They fought with exceptional courage and skill, and they suffered approximately 8,000 casualties in the first 3 days, a 36% loss rate that shocked even the German high command accustomed to high casualties. The survivors eventually captured Crete, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Hitler was so disturbed by the losses that he prohibited future large-scale airborne operations, effectively ending German offensive airborne doctrine for the remainder of the war. The lessons from Crete were debated endlessly in the Allied planning sessions. Some concluded that airborne assault was inherently too costly to be viable. Others argued that German mistakes, particularly landing directly on defended positions in daylight without adequate fire support, could be avoided through better planning. The debate was never fully resolved because both positions had merit, and the only way to determine which was correct was to conduct operations and count the bodies afterward. By mid-1943, the United States had committed to building 5 airborne divisions: the 11th, 13th, 17th, 82nd, and 101st. This represented an enormous investment of manpower, training resources, specialized equipment, and transport aircraft. An airborne division at full strength numbered approximately 13,000 men, organized differently from standard infantry divisions to emphasize light, mobile operations. They had fewer heavy weapons, less organic artillery, and minimal vehicle transport. They were designed to arrive by air, fight for 3 to 5 days with the supplies they carried or captured, and be relieved by conventional forces advancing to link up with them. This operational concept required perfect synchronization between airborne assault and ground advance, both of which had to proceed according to optimistic timelines. If the ground forces were delayed, the paratroopers would be surrounded, outnumbered, and eventually overwhelmed. If the paratroopers failed to secure their objectives, the ground advance would stall. The doctrine assumed competent execution of both components simultaneously under combat conditions, an assumption that was optimistic at best. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, became one of the strongest advocates for airborne forces, despite having no personal experience with the parachute operations. His support was based on strategic calculation rather than tactical enthusiasm. Marshall understood that the United States faced a fundamental problem in both European and Pacific theaters: how to project ground combat power across vast distances against prepared enemies. Conventional amphibious assault was slow, costly, and telegraphed Allied intentions weeks in advance as landing forces assembled. Airborne assault promised speed and surprise, the ability to strike where the enemy was weak rather than where they were prepared. In a June 1943 memo to General Eisenhower, Marshall called airborne forces our ace in the hole, capable of achieving results disproportionate to their numbers. This characterization was both accurate and misleading. Accurate in that a well-executed airborne operation could indeed accomplish missions that would cost conventional forces far more in time and casualties. Though misleading in that it implied airborne forces were a reliable trump card rather than a high-risk gamble that could fail spectacularly. The operational planning for Sicily in summer 1943 crystallized the tensions between airborne theory and reality. Allied planners needed to invade Sicily as a stepping stone to mainland Italy. The invasion would be primarily amphibious, with troops landing on beaches backed by cliffs and defended by Italian and German forces. The obvious role for airborne forces was to seize high ground overlooking the beaches, preventing enemy artillery from devastating the landing forces. This mission fit perfectly with airborne doctrine: a clear objective, direct impact on the larger operation's success, and an expectation of relief within 24 to 48 hours. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, responsible for air operations, objected strenuously. His analysis of the plan predicted catastrophic results. Widely scattered drops due to inexperienced pilots and nighttime navigation difficulties, high casualties from landing in enemy-held territory, and probable mission failure. He recommended canceling the airborne component entirely. General Eisenhower, overall Allied commander, read Lee Mallory's assessment and then approved the airborne operation anyway. His decision was based on strategic desperation as much as confidence. The amphibious landings were risky enough that any edge, even a questionable one, was worth the cost. The debate over airborne employment revealed a fundamental disagreement about their proper role. Some commanders viewed paratroopers as raiders, lightly armed troops who would strike behind enemy lines, cause chaos, and withdraw before enemy forces could respond. This matched British Special Operations thinking and the successful German raids on Eben im Mael and other fortresses. Other commanders viewed paratroopers as assault infantry, shock troops who would seize and hold critical terrain until relieved by conventional forces. This matched Soviet doctrine and the German approach at Crete. The difference was not merely tactical, but philosophical. Raiders emphasized mobility, surprise, and minimal engagement with enemy forces. Assault infantry emphasized holding ground regardless of cost until the mission was accomplished or the force was destroyed. American doctrine tried to split the difference, envisioning paratroopers who could raid when appropriate and hold when necessary. This doctrinal flexibility was attractive in theory, but confusing in practice as it left the mission parameters unclear and made planning difficult. Paratroopers training for Sicily didn't know whether they were expected to hit and withdraw or land and defend, because the planners themselves hadn't decided. General Matthew Ridgway, who took command of the 82nd Airborne Division in October 1942, brought a critically important perspective to airborne doctrine development. Ridgway was not an airborne enthusiast by background. He was an infantry officer who had never jumped from an aircraft before receiving his command. His initial reaction to paratrooper culture was skeptical. He viewed the swagger and elite self-image as potentially undermining discipline. But after observing training and studying German after-action reports, Ridgway reached a crucial conclusion. The greatest strength of airborne forces was not their ability to land precisely on objectives, but their demonstrated capacity to function effectively when scattered, disorganized, and surrounded. The German reports from Crete describe small groups of Allied defenders being paralyzed by uncertainty when German paratroopers appeared behind them, even when those paratroopers numbered only a handful of men. Ridgway theorized that the psychological impact of airborne assault, the fear and confusion generated by enemy soldiers appearing from the sky, might be more valuable than the direct tactical accomplishment of seizing specific objectives. This insight would prove prophetic in Sicily, where scattered American paratroopers achieved strategic effects vastly disproportionate to their numbers purely through the chaos they created. The force multiplication theory rested on several assumptions that would be tested in combat. First, that airborne forces could be delivered with sufficient accuracy that most men landed near enough to their objectives to accomplish the mission. Second, that paratroopers could assemble into effective fighting units quickly after landing, despite inevitable dispersion. Third, that lightly armed paratroopers could hold critical terrain against heavier enemy forces for the required duration. Fourth, that transport aircraft could deliver the force and survive the transit despite enemy air defenses. Fifth, and that ground forces advancing to link up with the paratroopers would adhere to optimistic timelines. Any single assumption failing could compromise the entire operation. Multiple assumptions failing simultaneously would turn an airborne assault into a disaster. The planners knew this. They proceeded anyway because the strategic situation demanded accepting risks that peacetime analysis would reject. The alternative to risky airborne operations was conventional operations that were also risky but more predictable in their costs. The choice was between certain high casualties in conventional assault or uncertain but potentially lower casualties in airborne assault. Neither option was good. One had to be chosen anyway. By the time American paratroopers boarded aircraft for Sicily in July 1943, the theoretical debate over airborne warfare had been exhaustively argued in staff meetings, war games, and planning sessions. The theory said that 13,000 elite soldiers delivered behind enemy lines could accomplish what conventional forces could not. The theory said that surprise and speed would compensate for light armament and numerical inferiority. The theory said that the psychological shock of soldiers falling from the sky would paralyze enemy response long enough for the paratroopers to seize their objectives. The theory was developed by intelligent officers using the best available information and informed by careful study of German and Soviet operations. The theory was also completely untested by actual American combat experience, based on assumptions about pilot skill, navigation accuracy, equipment reliability, and soldier performance that had never been validated under fire. The men loading into C-47s in North Africa on the night of July 9, 1943, were about to discover whether the theory was brilliant or catastrophically wrong. They would learn the answer in the most direct way possible, by jumping into darkness over hostile territory and seeing whether they lived or died. The force multiplication theory was about to receive its first and most brutal examination, graded not in academic papers, but in casualty reports and mission assessments written by the survivors. July 9, 1943, 2300 hours, over the Mediterranean Sea. Lieutenant Colonel James Gavin sits in the stick seat of a C-47, watching the 19 men of his stick through the dim red light of the cargo compartment. They've been airborne for 90 minutes, maintaining formation, heading towards Sicily. Outside, 225 other aircraft carry the rest of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment toward their objectives inland from Gela. The plan calls for precision drops on designated zones, assembly within 30 minutes, movement to objectives before dawn. Gavin has studied the plan until he could recite it from memory. He believes in the plan approximately as much as he believes in Santa Claus. Then the aircraft shudders. Through the open door, Gavin sees tracers rising from the dark coastline ahead, streams of red and white light reaching toward the formation. Anti-aircraft fire, far more intense than intelligence predicted. The C-47's pilot takes evasive action, throwing the aircraft into a violent bank. Men in the stick grab for handholds. Gavin watches the formation disintegrate as aircraft scatter in all directions, some climbing, some diving, some turning back toward North Africa. He realizes with sudden clarity that the plan is already destroyed and they haven't even jumped yet. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment consisted of 3,405 men organized into 3 battalions plus supporting elements. The operational plan called for them to drop on designated zones inland from Gela Beach, where the 1st Infantry Division would land at dawn. The paratroopers were to seize high ground, block roads that German reinforcements might use, and prevent enemy artillery from firing on the beaches. If executed according to plan, the drop would place organized American units behind enemy defenses before those defenses could respond. The plan assumed that C-47 pilots, most of whom had never flown in combat, could navigate at night over water, locate drop zones in the dark using minimal navigation aids, and maintain formation while being shot at. These assumptions proved optimistic within minutes of crossing the Sicilian coast. The anti-aircraft fire erupted from positions that intelligence had either missed or underestimated. Pilots who had never experienced combat reacted instinctively to avoid being shot down, which meant breaking formation and taking evasive action. Some turned back toward North Africa. Others climbed above the anti-aircraft fire. Yet many simply flew in whatever direction seemed to offer escape from the tracers. The result was complete dissolution of the planned drops. Paratroopers exited aircraft wherever the green light came on, which in many cases was nowhere near their assigned zones. Lieutenant Colonel Gavin landed alone in a vineyard approximately 25 miles from his intended drop zone. He had no idea where he was, only that it was Sicily, and there were probably enemies nearby. Standard operating procedure called for assembly at designated rally points using passwords and signals. But Gavin had no idea where the rally points were in relation to his position, and the scattered nature of the drop meant most men wouldn't reach rally points anyway. He made a command decision that would become fundamental to Airborne Doctrine. Stop trying to assemble organized units and start moving toward the general objective area with whatever men he could find. Over the next 6 hours, Gavin walked across Sicily in the dark, collecting paratroopers from various units. By dawn, he had assembled approximately 100 men from multiple companies. They didn't have proper organization or all their equipment, but they were armed, mobile, and led by an officer who knew the general mission even if specific plans were irrelevant now. This ad hoc group would accomplish more than many larger units operating according to Doctrine. The objective at Piano Lupo illustrated both the chaos and the unexpected effectiveness of the scattered drop. Piano Lupo was a critical road junction that German and Italian reinforcements would use to reach Gela Beach. The plan assigned a full company, approximately 180 men, to seize and hold it. When dawn came on July 10th, exactly 18 paratroopers from various units had found their way to Piano Lupo. They were commanded by a lieutenant whose name would be lost to history, led men from companies they'd never trained with, and faced a tactical situation that no Doctrine manual addressed: how to hold a critical position with 1/10 the assigned force. They did it anyway. Using the terrain, fighting from concealment, retreating and reappearing unpredictably, those 18 men convinced Italian forces approaching Piano Lupo that they faced a much larger American unit. The Italians called for artillery support. They deployed more troops and took 6 hours to advance through terrain they should have crossed in 30 minutes. Those 6 hours were critical. They allowed American forces landing at Gela to consolidate beachheads without facing immediate counterattack. 18 men, landing in the wrong place, assembling by accident, accomplished a mission planned for 10 times their number. The mathematics of the drop told a story of comprehensive failure that somehow produced partial success. Of 3,405 paratroopers who jumped, fewer than 200 landed within 1 mile of their assigned drop zones. That represented a 6% accuracy rate compared to the planned 90%. Some men landed 60 miles from their intended zones, some in the British sector, and some in the Mediterranean Sea where they drowned before anyone could retrieve them. Some landed in minefields and died before reaching enemy contact. Some landed on cliffs and broke bones in the impact. Some landed directly in enemy positions and were killed or captured within minutes. The dispersion was so complete that standard military analysis would conclude the operation was a catastrophic failure. Yet the scattered men created chaos throughout the Sicilian interior that paralyzed Italian response and delayed German reinforcements. Every small group of Americans appearing unexpectedly forced enemy commanders to divert forces to investigate, defend, or counterattack. The cumulative effect of dozens of small firefights was strategically significant, even though no individual action was decisive. The paratroopers had failed to execute the plan, but succeeded in creating conditions that helped the amphibious landing succeed. The second wave turned disaster into catastrophe. On the night of July 11th to 12th, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment prepared to jump into Sicily to reinforce the 505th. 2,000 men loaded into 144 C-47s in North Africa, preparing for a night drop over the Gela area. The flight plan called for the aircraft to approach Sicily from the south, flying over Allied naval forces and the beachhead before turning inland to drop zones. What the flight plan didn't adequately account for was that those same naval forces and beach defenders had spent the previous 2 days being attacked by German aircraft. They were tired, nervous, and primed to shoot at anything flying overhead at night. The C-47s approached the coast in formation. The lead aircraft crossed the coastline, and Allied anti-aircraft guns opened fire on what they identified as hostile aircraft. The official inquiry later determined that ship-to-shore communication failures meant naval forces were not properly informed of the flight plan. The result was that Allied forces shot down 23 American transport aircraft and damaged 37 others. 81 paratroopers and aircrew died from friendly fire, more casualties than the regiment would suffer from enemy action in the next week. The survivors of that second wave, who made it to Sicily, landed scattered across an even wider area than the first wave. Many pilots, seeing their formation being destroyed by friendly fire, turned back toward North Africa without completing the drop. Others dropped their paratroopers wherever they happened to be when the fire became unbearable, which was often far from intended zones. Of the 2,000 men in the 504th, only about 400 made it to Sicily and found friendly forces. The rest were scattered, lost, or dead. The friendly fire incident created immediate calls for courts-martial and investigations. Some pilots refused to fly subsequent missions with paratroopers, convinced that jumping men into combat at night over friendly forces was suicidal regardless of enemy action. The confidence of both aircrew and paratroopers was severely damaged. Many soldiers who survived Sicily would later say that the flight in was more terrifying than the actual combat. Because at least in combat, you could shoot back. Under friendly anti-aircraft fire, all you could do was sit in the aircraft and wait to see if the next burst would kill you. The scattered landings created unintended benefits that partially offset the execution failures. German commanders, trying to assess American strength and intentions, received reports of paratroopers appearing across a vast area of Sicily. Small groups were spotted near Niscemi, Vittoria, Ragusa, and dozens of other locations. The reports made it appear that the Americans had dropped not 3,000 men, but tens of thousands, saturating the entire invasion area. German intelligence officers, analyzing the pattern, concluded that the Allies had committed far more airborne forces than actually existed. This overestimation caused German commanders to hold back mobile reserves, fearing that any movement would expose them to more airborne attacks. The hesitation gave Allied beach forces critical time to consolidate. The paratroopers achieved strategic deception accidentally, through failure of execution rather than success of planning. This was not how airborne doctrine was supposed to work, but it worked nonetheless. The question was whether accidental success justified the human cost. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole exemplified both the courage and the cost of Sicily operations. Cole commanded the 1st Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. He jumped in the second wave, survived the friendly fire, landed approximately 40 miles from his intended drop zone, and spent 3 days walking across Sicily collecting men from his battalion and others. By July 14th, Cole had assembled roughly 150 men and made contact with friendly forces. His battalion should have numbered 600. 3/4 of his men were missing, scattered, wounded, captured, or dead. Cole received orders to continue operations as if he commanded a full battalion because there was no time to reconstitute units properly. He led his reduced force in combat for 2 more weeks, conducting operations planned for 3 times as many men. This was the reality of airborne operations in Sicily. Small groups of men accomplishing missions designed for larger forces, or failing to accomplish them and improvising alternatives. Cole would survive Sicily, continue to combat in Normandy, and die from a sniper's bullet in Holland. His service illustrated the trajectory of many airborne officers: exceptional courage, continuous combat, eventual death. The casualty accounting after Sicily revealed numbers that should have ended the airborne program. Of the 505th Regiment's 3,405 men, 592 were killed, wounded, or missing after the first week. That represented a 17% casualty rate, sustainable for conventional operations, but devastating for elite units that took months to train and couldn't be quickly replaced. The 504th suffered even worse proportionally, with over 600 casualties from a smaller initial force. Equipment losses were equally severe. Approximately 40% of paratroopers who made it to Sicily landed without their weapons, which had broken loose during descent or landing. Radios, critical for coordinating scattered units, were lost at an even higher rate. Machine guns and mortars that had been packed in equipment bundles were scattered across the countryside, often never recovered. Some companies that jumped with full heavy weapons, complements found themselves fighting as rifle squads because everything except individual weapons was lost in the drop or landing. The equipment failures validated every concern that engineers had raised during development. But the validation came too late for the men who landed unarmed in enemy territory. The strategic assessment of Sicily was debated for months and never fully resolved. On one hand, the operation was clearly a failure of execution. Drops were wildly scattered, casualties were high. Friendly fire killed more Americans than should have died in any operation. On the other hand, the beach landing succeeded with fewer casualties than predicted, and the airborne presence, however chaotic, contributed to that success by creating confusion and delay among enemy forces. General Eisenhower seriously considered disbanding the airborne divisions and converting them to regular infantry. General Ridgway argued forcefully that Sicily proved the concept, despite the execution failures. His argument was that paratroopers had demonstrated they could function effectively when scattered, could accomplish missions with reduced numbers, and could create strategic effects through tactical chaos. The decision to continue the Airborne program was not based on confidence that problems had been solved, but on the calculation that the potential benefits outweighed the proven costs. This was a gamble, but warfare is full of gambles. The question was whether subsequent operations would learn from Sicily's lessons or repeat its failures. The answer would come in Normandy. August 3, 1943, Allied Force Headquarters, Tunis. General Dwight Eisenhower sits behind a desk covered with casualty reports from Sicily, photographs of destroyed C-47s, and after-action assessments that use words like catastrophic and unacceptable with disturbing frequency. Across from him, General Matthew Ridgway waits with the tension of a man whose entire career depends on the next 15 minutes. Then Eisenhower has summoned Ridgway to discuss the future of airborne operations, a discussion that both men know is actually about whether airborne divisions will be disbanded. Eisenhower begins without preamble. "Matt, I've got advisors telling me that Sicily proved airborne assault doesn't work, that we're wasting elite soldiers on a concept that can't be executed reliably. Give me one reason why I shouldn't convert the 82nd and 101st to regular infantry divisions." Ridgway doesn't hesitate. "Because, General, we learned more from Sicily than the Germans learned from Crete. They concluded airborne assault was too costly and stopped doing it. We can conclude it was poorly executed and fix it." Eisenhower leans back, fingers steepled. "Convince me you can fix it." The systematic review of Sicily failures was comprehensive and brutal. 5 major categories of failure were identified, each contributing to the operational disaster. First, navigation failures caused by inadequate pilot training and poor navigation equipment. Most C-47 pilots had minimal night flying experience and no combat experience. They navigated using dead reckoning and visual landmarks that were nearly impossible to identify in darkness. When they encountered anti-aircraft fire, their instinct was to evade rather than maintain course to the drop zone. This was rational self-preservation, but devastating to the mission. Second, communication failures between air and ground forces. The friendly fire incident occurred largely because naval forces and ground units were not properly informed about the flight paths and timing of paratrooper drops. Third, equipment failures, particularly weapons breaking loose during descent and equipment bundles being lost. Fourth, lack of coordination between Pathfinder teams and main forces. The Pathfinders who jumped first to mark drop zones were too few, too scattered, and lacked adequate marking equipment. Fifth, unrealistic expectations about post-landing assembly. The plan assumed paratroopers could gather at rally points and form organized units within 30 minutes of landing. In reality, scattered drops across vast areas made assembly impossible within the planned time frame. Or the response to these identified failures was systematic reform across every aspect of airborne operations. Navigation improvements came first. The Army Air Forces established a mandatory 90-day training program specifically for troop carrier pilots, emphasizing night flying, formation flying under adverse conditions, and navigation over water without visual landmarks. The Eureka-Rebecca radar system was introduced, with Pathfinder teams carrying Eureka transponder beacons that would broadcast signals to Rebecca receivers on approaching aircraft. This gave pilots a radio navigation aid that didn't depend on the visual identification of drop zones. The system wasn't perfect, but testing showed it improved accuracy dramatically compared to visual navigation alone. Pilot training was expanded to include flying under simulated combat conditions, with searchlights and simulated anti-aircraft fire to accustom them to continuing on course despite distractions. The goal was to condition pilots to complete their mission even when being shot at, fighting against the natural instinct to escape danger. Communication protocols were completely overhauled. The friendly fire disaster at Sicily resulted in new requirements that all Allied naval and ground forces had to be informed of any paratrooper operations at least 24 hours in advance. Safe lanes were established, specific corridors through friendly territory that transport aircraft could use without being fired upon. These lanes had to be clearly marked on every ship and ground unit's operations map. Recognition signals were standardized. More with transport aircraft required to fly specific approach patterns and speeds that would identify them as friendly. Colored flares and radio frequencies dedicated to airborne operations coordination were established. None of these measures could guarantee against friendly fire completely, because the confusion of combat made mistakes inevitable, but they reduced the probability from near certain to merely possible, which was a significant improvement. Equipment modifications addressed the most obvious failures. The leg bag system for carrying heavy equipment was refined, with stronger attachment points and redundant fasteners to reduce separation during descent. The Griswold bag was reinforced and its attachment method improved, though it would never achieve the reliability that planners wanted. Weapon scabbards were redesigned with additional padding and more secure mounting. Reserve parachutes became absolutely mandatory for all combat jumps, overriding any objections about weight. The parachute harness quick-release system was modified to require a positive two-step action to prevent accidental activation during descent. Radio equipment was given priority in equipment allocation, with orders that every battalion had to land with at least minimal radio capability to coordinate scattered elements. These modifications were improvements, not solutions. Equipment would continue to fail throughout the war, but at lower rates than in Sicily. The Pathfinder concept became central to reformed airborne doctrine. Pathfinder teams, typically 12 to 15 men per drop zone, would jump 30 to 45 minutes before the main force. Their mission was to mark the drop zone with lights, radar beacons, and colored panels that approaching aircraft could identify from altitude and distance. Pathfinder training became the most demanding in the airborne program. These men had to jump in complete darkness with no support, land in enemy territory, set up equipment under possible enemy fire, and guide in the main force even if they were under attack. The Pathfinder course, established at the Parachute School in September 1943, had a 40% washout rate. The men who completed it were recognized as elite even among paratroopers, wearing distinctive Pathfinder patches. Their role would prove critical in subsequent operations. But it also created a new vulnerability. If Pathfinders were killed or captured before marking zones, the main force would drop blind exactly as in Sicily. The Salerno drop in September 1943 served as the first test of reformed procedures. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment conducted a reinforcement drop during the invasion of Italy, jumping to support Allied forces struggling to hold the Salerno beachhead. This time, Pathfinders jumped first and successfully marked drop zones. Pilots used the Eureka-Rebecca system and flew pre-briefed approach routes. Naval forces were informed and held fire. The result was dramatically improved accuracy. Approximately 80% of paratroopers landed within operational distance of their assigned zones, compared to 6% in Sicily. Casualties from the drop itself were minimal, with most injuries being the normal sprains and fractures from landing, rather than catastrophic equipment failures or navigational disasters. The mission's success validated the reforms and gave Eisenhower confidence that airborne operations could be planned for the invasion of France without expecting Sicily-level catastrophe. The joint training requirement became mandatory for all subsequent airborne operations. Parachute regiments were assigned specific troop carrier groups, and those units trained together for months before combat operations. Pilots learned to recognize the jump commands and hand signals that paratroopers used. Paratroopers learned to understand the limitations and capabilities of C-47 aircraft. They conducted practice jumps together until both air and ground crew could execute the operation smoothly under difficult conditions. This training relationship created personal connections between pilots and paratroopers that proved valuable in combat. When pilots knew the men they were carrying, they were more likely to press on to the drop zone despite danger rather than abort or drop early. The investment in joint training was expensive in time and resources, but Sicily had proven that the cost of inadequate training was far higher. The psychological impact of Sicily on paratrooper morale was complex and contradictory. On one hand, the survivors had proven they could function in chaotic conditions, accomplish missions with scattered forces, and survived despite catastrophic execution failures. This bred confidence that they could handle whatever combat threw at them. On the other hand, the friendly fire incident and the high casualty rates created deep skepticism about whether command leadership could be trusted to plan operations competently. Many paratroopers who jumped at Sicily developed a dark fatalism. They would do their job regardless of how badly everything else went wrong, because that was all they could control. This attitude was simultaneously professional and disturbing. Professional in that it demonstrated commitment to mission accomplishment. Disturbing in that it reflected profound distrust of higher command. Officers at regiment and division level worked to rebuild that trust through transparency about lessons learned and visible improvements in training and equipment. The trust was never fully restored, but it improved enough that men would continue to board aircraft for subsequent operations. The debate over proper employment of airborne forces continued, despite the operational improvements. Some commanders still viewed paratroopers as raiders, best used for surgical strikes on specific high-value targets. Others saw them as assault infantry capable of seizing and holding key terrain. The Sicily experience suggested a third role: disruptors who created strategic chaos through tactical dispersion. The scattered drops, which were failures according to plan, had generated enemy confusion and delay that contributed to overall mission success. This raised an uncomfortable question. Should future operations actually plan for dispersion rather than trying to prevent it? The answer was politically unacceptable. Or because no commander would deliberately plan to scatter his forces across a vast area with no organized assembly. But the question persisted in theoretical discussions and influenced planning in subtle ways. Drop zones were sometimes deliberately spread over wider areas than absolutely necessary, accepting some dispersion as inevitable and trying to leverage it rather than fight it. By early 1944, as planning for the invasion of France intensified, airborne forces had evolved significantly from the experimental program of 1940. They had combat experience, refined equipment, improved doctrine, and demonstrated capability. They also had a clearer understanding of their limitations and the operational risks inherent in vertical envelopment. The question was no longer whether American paratroopers could fight effectively, but whether the strategic benefits justified the continued investment and inevitable casualties. The answer from Supreme Allied Headquarters was yes. Airborne forces would play a critical role in the Normandy invasion, but the lessons of Sicily and Salerno would shape that role, influencing drop zone selection, pathfinder employment, and contingency planning for scattered landings. The men training in England for the invasion of France were better prepared than those who had jumped into Sicily. Whether that preparation would be sufficient depended on factors beyond training: weather, enemy dispositions, equipment reliability, and the unpredictable chaos that was combat. The lessons had been learned, that now they had to be applied under the most demanding conditions imaginable, jumping into occupied France in darkness with the outcome of the war potentially hanging on their success or failure. January 26, 1944, SHAEF Headquarters, Bushy Park, London. A conference room full of senior officers studies aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across a massive table. The images show the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, specifically the area behind Utah Beach, where flooded fields stretch inland for miles. General Omar Bradley traces the causeway routes with his finger, thin elevated roads that are the only paths from the beach to solid ground. Gentlemen, if the Germans hold these causeways, the 4th Infantry Division will be trapped on the beach, unable to advance inland. We'll have 15,000 men packed into a killing zone with no room to maneuver. He looks up at General Maxwell Taylor, newly appointed commander of the 101st Airborne Division. Max, your division has to take these exits before the beach landing. If you don't, the invasion stalls before it starts. Taylor studies the photographs, noting the flooded areas, the German positions, the miles of bocage hedgerows. He's done the mathematics. 13,000 men dropping in darkness over enemy territory, expected to seize 4 causeways across 6 miles of front, and hold them against whatever the Germans can throw until beach forces link up. He meets Bradley's eyes. We'll take them, General, but I need you to understand that casualties could be severe. Bradley nods grimly. Understood. They'll plan on it. The operational planning for Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, represented the culmination of 4 years of airborne development and hard-won lessons from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The plan called for the largest airborne operation in history: 17,000 paratroopers and glider infantry from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, plus British airborne forces, all dropping in darkness hours before the beach landings. The American airborne mission was straightforward in concept and desperately complex in execution. The 101st would drop behind Utah Beach, seize the 4 causeway exits, destroy bridges over the Douve River to prevent German reinforcements from the south, and capture the town of Carentan to link Utah with Omaha Beach. The 82nd would drop further inland, always capture the town of Santa Maria to control a critical road junction, secure the western flank of the invasion, and destroy bridges to prevent German armor from counterattacking the beachhead. If successful, the airborne drops would create a protective shield behind Utah Beach, allowing the 4th Infantry Division to advance inland rapidly and expand the beachhead. If unsuccessful, the beach forces would be trapped in a narrow coastal strip under German artillery fire, and the entire invasion could fail. The intelligence picture was simultaneously detailed and incomplete. Allied reconnaissance had photographed every square mile of the Cotentin Peninsula from multiple angles and altitudes. Photo interpreters had identified German positions, fortifications, troop concentrations, and defensive obstacles. They knew about the flooded areas behind Utah Beach, the result of German engineers deliberately breaching dikes to create barriers against airborne or amphibious assault. They knew about Rommel's asparagus, thousands of wooden poles planted in the fields to destroy gliders attempting to land. They knew about the German 91st Luftland Division, an air landing division positioned precisely in the area where American paratroopers would drop. What they didn't know with certainty was exactly how the Germans would respond to a night airborne assault, how quickly reinforcements could arrive, or whether the flooded areas would be deep enough to drown paratroopers who landed in them. The intelligence officers provided their best assessments. The airborne commanders planned operations knowing that those assessments could be catastrophically wrong. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, commanding Allied air forces, submitted his famous May 19th memo predicting 50% casualties for the airborne forces and recommending cancellation of the operation. His analysis was based on Sicily's experience, German defensive preparations, and the complexity of night drops over flooded terrain. Lee Mallory calculated that between 7,000 and 8,000 paratroopers would be killed, wounded, or captured before accomplishing their missions, making the entire operation a wasteful sacrifice of elite troops. The memo created a crisis in Allied command. Eisenhower read it, consulted with his subordinate commanders, and made the decision to proceed anyway. His reasoning was strategic necessity. Without airborne forces securing the causeways, the beach landing was too risky. The choice was not between airborne assault with high casualties and beach assault with low casualties. The choice was airborne assault with predicted high casualties versus beach assault with likely catastrophic casualties if the Germans controlled the causeways. Eisenhower chose the option that gave the overall invasion the best chance of success, even knowing it would cost thousands of lives. The training for Normandy was the most intensive preparation any American military unit had received to that point in the war. From February through May 1944, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions conducted full-scale rehearsals of the invasion operation. They built scale models of Norman villages, photographed from reconnaissance aircraft, with every building, hedge, and road reproduced in miniature. Soldiers studied these models for hours, memorizing the terrain, identifying rally points and objectives, planning movement routes. They conducted practice jumps over English countryside that resembled Normandy topography, learning to navigate through hedgerows and flooded areas. They practiced assembly in darkness, using signals and passwords that would identify friendly soldiers. The invasion password was Flash, answered by Thunder. A soldier who called Flash and didn't hear Thunder in response would shoot first and identify targets later. This was the grim reality of night combat in enemy territory. The Pathfinder teams received special attention and training. By 66 men from the 101st and 45 from the 82nd were selected for Pathfinder duty, trained to jump at least 30 minutes before the main force and mark drop zones with Eureka radar beacons and holophane lights. These men would exit aircraft over enemy-occupied France in complete darkness with no support, land alone or in small groups, make their way to designated drop zones while avoiding or fighting German patrols, set up equipment that might draw enemy fire, and guide in thousands of follow-on paratroopers while under possible attack. The Pathfinder selection criteria emphasized intelligence, initiative, and calm under pressure. Physical courage was assumed. Every paratrooper had that. The Pathfinders needed something beyond courage, the ability to function independently, solve problems without orders, and complete the mission even if everyone else on the team was dead or captured. The training was deliberately stressful, placing Pathfinders in scenarios designed to induce confusion and fear, then evaluating their ability to complete tasks anyway. The equipment load for Normandy jumpers was carefully calculated and still excessive. A fully equipped paratrooper would jump with approximately 120 pounds of gear, in addition to body weight. This included the main parachute and reserve parachute, weapons, ammunition, rations, water, radio, or explosives depending on role, medical supplies, entrenching tool, and personal items. The leg bag, refined after Sicily's equipment losses, could carry an additional 20 pounds attached to the jumper's leg and lowered on a rope during descent. The total load of 140 pounds changed the physics of the jump significantly. Exit speed from the aircraft was faster. Opening shock was more violent. Landing impact was harder. Men trained with this load until they could function, but the training never fully prepared them for the reality of landing at night in a flooded field while carrying weight equivalent to a small adult human. Some men would land in water over their heads, and the weight of their equipment would drag them under to drown in 4 feet of water. Others would land on dry ground but find themselves unable to rise quickly because of the equipment load, vulnerable to enemy fire during those critical seconds. The glider component of the Normandy operation added another layer of complexity and risk. Approximately 4,000 American soldiers would arrive in Normandy by glider rather than parachute, landing in Waco and Horsa gliders towed by C-47 aircraft and released over designated landing zones. The gliders carried heavy equipment that couldn't be parachuted: jeeps, anti-tank guns, medical supplies, radio equipment, and additional troops. The advantage of gliders was that they delivered men and equipment together in organized loads, avoiding the dispersion problem of parachute drops. The disadvantage was that glider landings were violent, uncontrolled crashes that frequently destroyed the glider and injured its occupants even when not under fire. Pilots called gliders flying coffins, a nickname that was simultaneously dark humor and accurate description. In Sicily, approximately 40% of gliders had been destroyed on landing through collision with obstacles, terrain features, or other gliders. Normandy planners expected similar attrition rates and allocated gliders accordingly, knowing that hundreds of men would be injured or killed in crashes before encountering enemy fire. The weather requirements for the invasion were narrow and unforgiving. The airborne drop required a night with sufficient moonlight for pilots to navigate and paratroopers to see the ground before landing, but not so much moonlight that aircraft would be easily visible to German anti-aircraft gunners. The beach landings required low tide to expose German beach obstacles that needed to be cleared. The combination of tidal and lunar conditions occurred only a few days each month. The initially scheduled invasion date of June 5th was postponed 24 hours due to weather. Eisenhower, meeting with his meteorologists on June 4th, received a forecast of a brief weather window opening on June 6th. The forecast predicted marginal conditions: cloud cover, wind, possible rain, but potentially acceptable for airborne operations. Eisenhower had to decide whether to launch the invasion in marginal weather or postpone for 2 weeks until the next favorable tide and moon phase. Postponement would mean keeping tens of thousands of soldiers in embarkation areas for another 2 weeks, during which time German intelligence might discover invasion plans. Eisenhower chose to go, knowing the weather would complicate operations, but calculating that delay was more dangerous than imperfect conditions. The briefings on June 4th and 5th were somber affairs. Officers who had studied the operation for months presented final details to men who would execute it. Maps were uncovered showing Normandy coastline. Soldiers realized they were finally learning their actual target after months of speculation. The briefings emphasized mission objectives: causeways, bridges, road junctions, all marked on the maps. They discussed German dispositions and expected resistance. They reviewed assembly procedures, signals, passwords, rally points. They did not dwell on casualty predictions, but everyone knew the numbers from Lee Mallory's memo, even if they weren't officially discussed. Chaplains conducted services. Some men wrote letters to be mailed if they died, sealed envelopes with instructions to their commanders. Others sharpened knives. All cleaned weapons, or simply sat quietly with their thoughts. The veterans of Sicily and Salerno had the 1,000-yard stare of men who knew what combat was like. The replacements who had joined the divisions after Italy were nervous in a different way, anxious about whether they would perform well or freeze when the moment came. On the evening of June 5, 1944, 13,000 American paratroopers boarded 822 C-47s and 104 gliders at airfields across southern England. They carried the accumulated lessons of 4 years of training and 3 combat operations. They jumped with improved equipment, refined tactics, better navigation aids, and clearer doctrine than the men who had jumped into Sicily. They also jumped with the knowledge that, even with all those improvements, the operation was fundamentally dangerous in ways that planning could mitigate but not eliminate. The aircraft took off in the gathering dusk, formed into massive streams, and turned toward France. In the cargo compartments, men sat in silence or made dark jokes or prayed according to their natures. They were about to execute the largest airborne operation in history, critical to the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history, upon which depended the liberation of Western Europe and the outcome of the war. No pressure. The men who had volunteered for paratrooper duty because they wanted to know if they were brave enough would receive a definitive answer in the next few hours. Some would discover they were brave. Some would discover they were terrified but functional, which was the same thing in practice. And some would discover nothing because they would be dead before sunrise. The aircraft droned across the channel toward darkness and war, and the test that would determine whether 4 years of preparation had been sufficient. June 6, 1944, 00:15 hours, 3,000 feet above Normandy. Private First Class. John Fitzgerald stands in the door of a C-47, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other holding his static line, staring into absolute darkness punctuated by tracers rising from the ground below. The jumpmaster, Staff Sergeant Bill Owens, has his hand on Fitzgerald's shoulder, waiting for the green light that will signal the drop zone. The aircraft shudders from anti-aircraft fire that sounds like hammers hitting a tin roof. Through the open door, E. Fitzgerald watches another C-47 explode in a fireball 200 yards to the left, flaming wreckage spiraling toward the ground. 17 men who were alive 1 second and gone the next. Owens squeezes Fitzgerald's shoulder. "Don't look at them. Look at the door." The green light flashes. Owens slaps Fitzgerald's back. "Go! Go! Go!" Fitzgerald jumps into the night, into the tracers, into the unknown, his mind absolutely blank, except for the training sequence. Exit position, count to 4, check canopy, prepare for landing. The parachute opens with its familiar violent jerk. Above him, the sky is filled with hundreds of parachutes, a snowstorm of silk against the darkness. Below, the ground is invisible. He has no idea if he's descending toward a field, a tree, a building, or water. Yet he finds out 20 seconds later when he hits flooded ground and goes underwater. The Pathfinder drops, beginning at 00:15 hours, went wrong almost immediately. Of the 18 Pathfinder teams assigned to mark drop zones for the 101st Airborne, only one team landed on its designated drop zone. The other 17 teams landed scattered across Normandy, some miles from their intended positions. The 82nd's Pathfinders experienced similar dispersion. Cloud cover over the Cotentin Peninsula was thicker than forecasted, forcing pilots to descend below optimal jump altitude to find visual references. The lower altitude gave pilots less time to identify drop zones, and the clouds obscured the terrain that they were supposed to use for navigation. Some pilots, unable to see the ground clearly, or dropped their pathfinders based on estimated position rather than confirmed landmarks. The result was that most drop zones would not be properly marked when the main force arrived 30 minutes later. The few Pathfinder teams that did land on target set up their Eureka beacons and holophane lights with textbook precision, but they were exceptions. The majority of the main force would drop without Pathfinder guidance, exactly the situation the Pathfinder program was designed to prevent. The main drop beginning at 0048 hours was chaos organized into 650 serial formations of aircraft, each formation carrying a plane load of paratroopers toward designated drop zones spread across a 25-mile front. Some formations encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire and broke apart as pilots took evasive action. Others flew through clouds so thick that pilots couldn't see the aircraft in front of them, let alone the ground. Navigation was by dead reckoning, radar, and intermittent visual references when clouds permitted. Some pilots were over target and knew it. Others thought they were over target but were actually miles away. Still others had no idea where they were but dropped their paratroopers on the theory that somewhere in Normandy was better than flying around until they got shot down. The result was scattering that exceeded even Sicily levels in some areas. Approximately 80% of paratroopers landed somewhere other than their designated drop zones. Some landed within walking distance of objectives. Others landed 20 miles from their units, in German-held towns, in flooded areas, in minefields, in trees. The randomness was complete and terrifying. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed in a field somewhere in Normandy with no idea exactly where. His experience was typical of thousands of paratroopers that night. He hit the ground, executed the parachute landing fall, collapsed his canopy, and listened. Rifle fire in the distance, aircraft engines overhead, someone shouting in German somewhere to his left. He pulled out his cricket clicker, a small metal device that made a distinctive clicking sound, and clicked it once. The appropriate response was 2 clicks. He heard 3 clicks from 30 yards away. Wrong response, possibly German. He moved quietly in the opposite direction, found a hedgerow, and crouched in the shadow to assess. He had his rifle, his ammunition, his maps and compass. He had no idea where his platoon was, where his company was, or where his objectives were relative to his position. He could hear other Americans nearby, clicking crickets, calling passwords, moving through the dark. Winters made a command decision: collect whoever he could find, determine their general location using compass and landmarks, and move toward the general objective area. Over the next 2 hours, he assembled approximately 12 men from 6 different companies. They didn't have proper organization or complete equipment, but they were armed, mobile, and led by an officer who understood that standing around waiting for orders was suicide. They started moving inland. Private John Steele's experience became legendary, but was uncommon in its specifics while representative in its horror. Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église, leaving him suspended 40 feet above the town square where German soldiers were fighting American paratroopers who had landed in the streets. Steele hung there, unable to free himself, watching men die below him, expecting German soldiers to shoot him at any moment. He played dead, hanging limp in his harness, for approximately 2 hours. German soldiers noticed him, but were too occupied with the firefight to climb the steeple and cut him down. Eventually, American paratroopers cleared the town and rescued Steele, who was cut down from the steeple with frostbitten hands and traumatic memories, but physically uninjured. His survival was extraordinary luck, but the situation that created it, landing in the middle of an enemy position with no control over the descent, was common. Hundreds of paratroopers landed directly in German positions that night. Most of them died within seconds or minutes. Steele survived through combination of German preoccupation and his own decision to remain motionless. His story would be retold for decades as an illustration of both the chaos of the drop and the strange luck that determined who lived and died. The flooded areas behind Utah Beach drowned men in darkness. The Germans had deliberately breached dikes, flooding fields to a depth ranging from inches to over 6 feet. In daylight, paratroopers could see water and land accordingly, shedding their parachutes before hitting the surface. In darkness, they had no warning. Some men landed in shallow water and waded out, wet but alive. And others landed in deep water with over 100 pounds of equipment and went under immediately. The weight of their gear dragged them down. Some managed to shed their parachutes and equipment and surface. Others, disoriented by the impact and shock of cold water, drowned within feet of dry ground. The exact number of men who drowned in the flooded areas was never determined with certainty, but estimates ranged from 100 to 300. These deaths were particularly tragic because they occurred without the men ever encountering enemy fire, killed by terrain and equipment rather than bullets. The flooded areas also scattered the units that landed in them, as soldiers who made it to dry ground were often separated from their equipment and had to spend critical time searching for weapons and supplies in the dark water. The casualties in the first 6 hours of the Normandy drop were lighter than Lee-Mallory had predicted, but still severe. Approximately 1,500 men were killed, wounded, or missing by dawn on June 6th. That represented an 11.5% casualty rate, significantly better than the 50% Lee-Mallory had forecast, but still substantial for an operation that had barely begun. The casualties were distributed unevenly. Some units landed relatively intact with light losses. Others were decimated, losing half their men to combat, accidents, drowning, and captures. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment suffered particularly heavy casualties when several aircraft were shot down, killing everyone aboard. The 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed so scattered that it took days to assemble even half its strength. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landing closer to its objectives, organized more quickly but suffered heavy casualties in the subsequent fighting to hold Sainte-Mère-Église against German counterattacks. Despite the scattering and the casualties, the mission was accomplished through the kind of improvisation that was becoming the hallmark of American airborne operations. The causeways from Utah Beach, the critical objective for the 101st Airborne, were all secured by dawn, though not by the units assigned to each one. Mixed groups of paratroopers from multiple companies and battalions found their way to the causeways, recognized their strategic importance, and defended them against German forces attempting to block the beach exits. At Causeway 2, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole assembled approximately 75 men from his 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, less than 1/8 of his battalion's strength, and conducted a bayonet charge across open ground to dislodge German defenders. The charge was tactically questionable and extraordinarily costly, with Cole's force suffering nearly 50% casualties. But it succeeded in securing the causeway at a critical moment when the 4th Infantry Division was beginning to advance inland from Utah Beach. Cole would receive the Medal of Honor for the action, one of multiple Medals of Honor awarded to airborne soldiers for actions on D-Day. Sainte-Mère-Église became the first French town liberated by Allied forces, captured by paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in the early hours of June 6th. The town was strategically critical, sitting at a road junction that German reinforcements would need to use to counterattack the beaches. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led the attack that cleared the town of German defenders by dawn. His men then prepared defenses against the inevitable German counterattacks. Throughout the day, German forces probed the American positions, trying to retake the town. The paratroopers held, often fighting in close combat through houses and streets, supplied only with the ammunition they had jumped with, because resupply had not yet arrived. By evening, Sainte-Mère-Église remained in American hands, a symbol of successful airborne assault and a practical barrier preventing German movement toward the beaches. The American flag that Krauss's men raised over the town became one of the iconic images of D-Day, though it was actually raised in an occupied war zone while fighting continued in surrounding areas. At 0630 hours, as dawn broke over Normandy, Major General Raymond Barton stood on Utah Beach watching the 4th Infantry Division advance inland. Paratroopers from mixed units were emerging from the fields, moving toward the beach to link up with advancing forces. Some were wounded, helping each other walk. Others were carrying captured German weapons and prisoners. All were exhausted, having fought through the night with minimal sleep and maximum stress. But they were alive, and they had accomplished the mission. The causeways were open. The beach exits were secured. German reinforcements were delayed and disrupted. Barton, who had been prepared for a catastrophic stalemate at the beach, instead found his division able to advance rapidly inland because airborne forces had cleared the way. He later wrote in his after-action report, "The airborne operations, while costly, were essential to the success of the beach landing. Without them, we would have faced a very different and much bloodier day." The dispersion that had seemed like failure when evaluated against the plan proved to be strategically effective when evaluated against results. German commanders, receiving reports of American paratroopers appearing across a vast area of the Cotentin Peninsula, concluded that the Allies had committed far more airborne forces than actually existed. The scattered drops created the impression of a massive envelopment, threatening German positions from multiple directions simultaneously. This overestimation of American strength caused German commanders to hesitate, to hold reserves rather than commit them immediately, to wait for clearer intelligence about Allied intentions. That hesitation gave American beach forces critical time to consolidate beachheads and advance inland. The paratroopers who had cursed their pilots for dropping them in the wrong places had unknowingly contributed to strategic deception that was perhaps more valuable than precise drops would have been. The chaos worked, though not in the way anyone had planned. By the end of D-Day, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had established a continuous defensive line behind Utah Beach, and linking scattered units into organized resistance. They had accomplished every major objective assigned to them. They had also suffered approximately 4,500 casualties from 13,000 men committed, a 35% loss rate that was sustainable for perhaps another 48 hours before the divisions would lose combat effectiveness. The question facing Allied command was how to employ these divisions going forward. They were designed for short-duration operations behind enemy lines, 3 to 5 days maximum before relief by conventional forces. But the fluid nature of the Normandy campaign created pressure to keep them in continuous combat because they were there. They were combat effective despite losses, and there were never enough troops to accomplish all the missions that needed doing. The decision would be made to keep them fighting, a decision that would lead to the hedgerow battles and the gradual transformation of elite airborne assault forces into line infantry ground, down by sustained combat. That story would unfold over the coming weeks. But on June 6th, the paratroopers had proven what they came to prove. American soldiers could jump into occupied enemy territory in darkness, land scattered and disorganized, and still accomplish missions that conventional forces could not. Whether that capability was worth the human cost remained debatable. That it existed was now beyond question. June 10th, 1944, near Carentan, Normandy. Sergeant Donald Burgett crouches behind a hedgerow that's older than the United States, a wall of earth and vegetation, 12 feet thick and 8 feet high. He's been in Normandy for 4 days and has learned to hate these ancient field boundaries with a passion that exceeds his hatred for Germans. The hedgerows turn every field into a fortress, every advance into a separate battle, every 50 yards into a distance measured in bodies. Burgett's squad is supposed to cross this particular field, seize the hedgerow on the opposite side, and continue advancing toward Carentan. The field is maybe 150 yards across. In open country, that's 90 seconds of running. In the bocage, it might be impossible. German machine gunners are dug into the far hedgerow, invisible until they open fire. American artillery can't see them to suppress them. Tank support can't maneuver through the narrow lanes between fields. This is infantry work, but the kind where you walk into machine gun fire and hope enough of you survive to close the distance. Burgett looks at the men in his squad, most of them replacements who jumped into Normandy with minimal training. He wonders how many will be alive in 10 minutes. Then the lieutenant blows his whistle, and there's no more time for wondering. The Norman bocage was agricultural landscape shaped by 1,000 years of peasant farming, each field separated from its neighbors by hedgerows that prevented livestock from wandering and marked property boundaries. The hedgerows consisted of earthen banks 3 to 5 feet high, topped by dense vegetation of thorns, brush, and trees that added another 5 to 10 feet of height. The banks themselves were compacted earth reinforced by root systems, dense enough to stop bullets and resistant to explosives. The fields they enclosed varied in size from tiny plots of an acre or less to larger pastures of several acres, creating a patchwork of natural fortifications that extended across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. No one had planned for this terrain. American training had occurred in England and the United States, over relatively open ground. Reconnaissance photographs had shown the hedgerows, but hadn't conveyed their tactical significance. The first American units to encounter them assumed they were minor obstacles that could be bypassed or quickly overcome. They learned otherwise through casualties measured in the hundreds. The tactical problem was simple to describe and nearly impossible to solve. To advance, line infantry had to cross open fields under observation and fire from defenders concealed in the opposite hedgerow. The defenders had every advantage: cover, concealment, prepared positions, overlapping fields of fire. The attackers had only courage and the knowledge that the mission required them to keep moving forward regardless of cost. Standard infantry tactics emphasized fire and maneuver. One element suppresses the enemy with rifle and machine gun fire, while another element maneuvers to flank or assault. In the bocage, suppressive fire was ineffective because you couldn't see the enemy to shoot at them. Flanking maneuvers required moving through adjacent fields, each of which had its own defenders. The result was frontal assault across open ground, and the kind of tactics that had been obsolete since the First World War, but remained the only option when terrain eliminated alternatives. Units tried to mitigate the casualties through careful preparation, reconnaissance, coordinated artillery support, but ultimately someone had to stand up and walk into machine gun fire. The men who did that died at rates that would have shocked commanders in any previous American war. The 101st Airborne Division, designed for 3-day operations behind enemy lines, found itself committed to continuous line combat in conditions that negated every advantage of airborne training. Paratroopers were selected and trained for agility, independent action, light infantry tactics. The hedgerow fighting required exactly the opposite: slow, methodical advances, strict unit cohesion, heavy fire support. The specialized skills that made someone an excellent paratrooper, the ability to land behind enemy lines and navigate to objectives independently, were irrelevant when fighting from one hedgerow to the next. The divisions might as well have been regular infantry, except that they lacked the heavy weapons and artillery organic to infantry divisions. They were elite troops being used for conventional missions, while equipped and organized for special operations. The mismatch was obvious to everyone from privates to generals, but the operational requirements of the Normandy campaign offered no alternatives. The beachhead had to be expanded, the Germans had to be pushed back. Airborne divisions were available and combat capable, so they stayed in the line despite mounting casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's bayonet charge at Carentan on June 13th became legendary and illustrated both the desperation and the courage of hedgerow combat. Cole's battalion was attempting to advance along a causeway toward Carentan, a critical town that connected Utah and Omaha beaches. The causeway was elevated above flooded fields on both sides, a narrow strip of ground with no cover and no flanking routes. German machine guns and mortars had the causeway zeroed in from prepared positions. Cole's battalion advanced partway along the causeway before German fire stopped them completely. They were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, taking casualties from mortars that bracketed their position with increasing accuracy. Cole faced a choice: stay pinned until the entire battalion was destroyed, retreat and fail the mission, or charge across 300 yards of open causeway directly into German positions. He chose to charge. At approximately 1300 hours, Cole blew a whistle and stood up, shouting for his men to follow. 70 men followed him. The rest stayed down, frozen by fear or rational calculation of survival probability. The charge covered 300 yards in approximately 90 seconds, men running at full speed toward German positions that poured rifle and machine gun fire into them. 20 men were killed outright. 50 were wounded, some of them mortally. The 30 men who reached the German positions alive were so shocked to have survived that they massacred the defenders with bayonets, grenades, and point-blank rifle fire. Cole himself killed 3 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. And the position was secured. The advance continued. Cole received the Medal of Honor, though he would not live to wear it. he would be killed by a sniper in Holland 3 months later. The bayonet charge succeeded tactically, but demonstrated the unsustainable nature of hedgerow combat. A battalion of 600 men had been reduced to under 300 effectives in 2 weeks of fighting. The casualty rate of 50% was typical for rifle companies in the bocage, catastrophic for elite airborne units that took months to train and couldn't be quickly replaced. The casualty statistics from the Normandy campaign told a story of attrition that destroyed units faster than they could be rebuilt. The 101st Airborne remained in combat for 33 consecutive days, from June 6th through July 8th, far longer than the 3 to 5 day operations the division was designed for. During that period, the division suffered 4,670 casualties from approximately 6,600 men who had jumped on D-Day. That represented a 71% casualty rate, unsustainable by any measure. The 82nd Airborne fared slightly better, with approximately 3,000 casualties from similar initial strength, a 45% loss rate. Some companies were reduced to 20 or 30 men from starting strengths of 180. Battalions that should have numbered 600 were fighting with 200 effectives. The divisions maintained combat capability through force of will and the leadership of officers who kept men fighting, despite exhaustion, fear, and the mathematical certainty that continuing to fight meant eventual death or wounding. The replacement crisis emerged within 2 weeks of the invasion. The casualty rates in Normandy were so high that the replacement pipeline couldn't keep up. Men were being killed or wounded faster than new paratroopers could be trained and sent from the United States. The solution was to lower standards and accelerate training, creating replacements who had the minimum 5 qualifying jumps and basic infantry training, but lacked the extensive preparation that the original volunteers had received. These replacements arrived in Normandy in July, were assigned to depleted companies, and went into combat with veterans who viewed them with suspicion. The cultural divide was stark. Veterans wore dirty, worn uniforms and equipment that showed months of use. They had the confidence of men who had survived combat, and the cynicism of men who had watched friends die. Replacements wore new uniforms and clean equipment. They had enthusiasm and anxiety, but no combat experience. The integration was difficult and often incomplete. Some replacements proved themselves in combat and were accepted. Others died before the veterans learned their names. The turnover created units where 70% of men had been with the company less than a month, destroying the cohesion that made infantry units effective. The tactical innovations developed in the hedgerows would influence American infantry doctrine for decades. Soldiers learned to use explosives to blow gaps in hedgerows rather than climbing over them, creating entry points that reduced exposure to enemy fire. Engineers developed the Rhino device, a set of steel teeth welded to the front of Sherman tanks that allowed them to plow through hedgerows instead of being forced to use narrow lanes where German anti-tank guns waited. Infantry learned to advance in smaller groups with tighter coordination, using overwhelming firepower to suppress one hedgerow while maneuver elements assaulted from flanks. The techniques reduced casualties compared to the early frontal assaults, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. The defender had every advantage, and wresting control of each field required paying in blood. The advances were measured in hundreds of yards per day, each yard purchased at terrible cost. The psychological toll of sustained combat in the hedgerows produced casualties that didn't appear in official statistics. Combat fatigue, and what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder, removed men from combat as effectively as bullets. Soldiers who had functioned well in the initial airborne assault began to break down after weeks of continuous fighting. They would freeze under fire, unable to move or respond to orders. They would shake uncontrollably. They would weep without apparent cause. Some would simply refuse to continue, sitting down and stating they could not go on. Medical officers were instructed to treat combat fatigue as a temporary condition, give men a few days of rest, and return them to combat. This worked for some. Others never recovered their combat effectiveness and were quietly transferred to rear area duties. The numbers were never officially compiled, but estimates suggest that combat fatigue casualties in Normandy approached 10 to 15% of total losses, men who were physically uninjured but psychologically destroyed by the sustained stress of daily combat with no foreseeable end. The question of proper employment of airborne forces was debated continuously during the Normandy fighting, but never resolved. Some commanders argued that airborne divisions should be withdrawn from the line after accomplishing their initial objectives, rested and refitted for future airborne operations. Others argued that the tactical situation required every available combat division to remain engaged regardless of original mission design. The latter argument prevailed through bureaucratic inertia more than strategic decision. No one formally decided to use airborne divisions as line infantry, and it simply happened because there was no good time to pull them out while fighting continued. The result was that the elite airborne divisions, trained at great expense for specialized missions, were ground down in conventional combat alongside regular infantry divisions. The special capabilities that justified their existence, the ability to conduct vertical envelopment operations, were irrelevant in hedgerow fighting, but no alternative employment existed. They fought as infantry because the mission required infantry, and they were available. By the time the 101st Airborne was finally withdrawn from combat on July 8th, the division that had jumped into Normandy essentially no longer existed. 71% casualties meant that most companies consisted primarily of replacements who had never made a combat jump. The veterans who remained were exhausted, cynical, and deeply skeptical of command decisions that had kept them fighting for 33 days straight. The division was sent to England for rest and refitting, a process that would take months and require absorbing thousands of new replacements. The 82nd Airborne remained in combat until mid-July with similar results. Both divisions would be rebuilt for future airborne operations. But they would never again be the organizations that had trained together for years before D-Day. They were now veteran combat divisions with a shared history of Normandy fighting, but they were no longer the tightly bonded units of original volunteers who had jumped together in training hundreds of times. That unit cohesion, once lost, could never be fully recreated. The replacements would learn to be paratroopers and would fight effectively, but the cultural continuity with the original volunteers was broken. The airborne divisions that jumped into Holland in September would be numerically similar to the divisions that jumped into Normandy, but fundamentally different in composition and character. July 23, 1944, Camp Chalons, France. A replacement depot sergeant processes paperwork for 2,000 newly arrived paratroopers, most of them fresh from Fort Benning, with exactly 5 qualifying jumps and 0 combat experience. The sergeant, a veteran of Sicily and Normandy with a Purple Heart and a pronounced limp from a hedgerow fragment wound, looks at these men and sees dead people who don't know they're dead yet. They're young, enthusiastic, proud of their jump wings. They ask eager questions about what combat is like, whether the rumors about hedgerow fighting are exaggerated, how soon they'll see action. The sergeant gives them the speech he's given to every replacement group. You're paratroopers, which means you volunteered to do something dangerous. You made 5 training jumps, which makes you qualified but not experienced. Combat is different from training in every way that matters. Listen to the veterans in your company. Do what they tell you. Stay alive long enough to become veterans yourselves. One replacement, a private who looks about 17, raises his hand. Sergeant, how long does it take to become a veteran? The sergeant considers the question. In Sicily, it took about 10 minutes of combat. In Normandy, some men became veterans before they landed. He settles for a simpler answer. You'll know when it happens, son. You'll absolutely know. The replacement system for airborne divisions in mid-1944 was a study in contradictions and compromises. The parachute school at Fort Benning was processing approximately 1,000 men per month, running multiple classes simultaneously through the 5-week training program. This production rate was sufficient to replace normal attrition from training accidents and medical discharges, but completely inadequate to replace combat losses from the Normandy campaign. The 101st Airborne alone needed over 4,000 replacements to return to full strength after Normandy. The 82nd needed approximately 3,000. Both divisions were scheduled for future operations and needed to be rebuilt quickly. The solution was to lower selection standards slightly, accelerate some training phases, and accept that replacement paratroopers would be less thoroughly prepared than the original volunteers. The minimum requirements remained: 5 qualifying jumps, basic infantry training, physical fitness standards. But the time from enlistment to combat assignment was reduced from 12 to 18 months for original volunteers to approximately 3 months for late war replacements. The cultural shock of integration was profound on both sides. Veterans of Normandy returned to England in July and August expecting rest and recovery. Instead, they found their depleted companies being filled with replacements who outnumbered the veterans 2 or 3 to 1. A rifle company that jumped into Normandy with 180 men, suffered 120 casualties, and returned with 60 veterans would receive 120 replacements to restore it to strength. Suddenly, the veterans were a minority in their own units, surrounded by men who wore the same uniform and jump wings, but had never been in combat. The replacements looked at the veterans with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The veterans looked at the replacements with skepticism and, sometimes, resentment. The veterans had earned their place through survival. The replacements had to earn theirs through acceptance by men who had learned not to invest emotionally in people who would probably be dead soon. The integration process was difficult, uncomfortable, and never entirely successful. The visible markers of veteran status became important for unit cohesion and identity. Veterans wore jump boots that showed months of wear, leather cracked and stained, blouse trousers faded from repeated washing. Their uniforms were patched and repaired. Many wore Purple Hearts or Combat Infantryman badges, decorations that proved combat service. Their equipment showed use and modification, personal adaptations learned through experience. Replacements wore new jump boots, fresh from supply, leather stiff and shiny. Their uniforms were unmarked by combat. Their equipment was issue standard without the modifications that combat taught. The difference was visible at 20 yards, a walking advertisement of who had been there and who hadn't. Some veterans used this visible difference to enforce hierarchy, demanding deference from replacements. Others tried to integrate the new men quickly, sharing knowledge and experience to prepare them for combat. The approaches varied by unit and individual personality, but the fundamental division between veterans and replacements persisted. The training regimen for integrated units tried to compress months of preparation into weeks. From August through early September 1944, the airborne divisions in England conducted intensive training to prepare for the next operation. Veterans worked with replacements, teaching lessons learned in Normandy, how to navigate by compass at night, how to recognize German weapons by sound, how to use terrain for cover, how to assemble scattered units after a drop. The replacements absorbed this information with varying degrees of success. Some were natural soldiers who learned quickly and adapted well. Others struggled with the pace and complexity of combat preparation. The training jump program continued, with companies conducting practice drops to familiarize replacements with procedures and rebuild unit cohesion. These training jumps produced the usual quota of injuries, sprains, and fractures that removed men from combat-ready status before they ever faced the enemy. The injured were replaced by more replacements in a cycle that continued until the divisions deployed for their next operation. The demographic composition of replacement paratroopers differed slightly from the original volunteers in ways that reflected changing national circumstances. The early volunteers of 1940 and 1941 had been Depression-era young men seeking adventure, extra pay, or escape from economic hardship. The replacements of mid to late 1944 were draftees and volunteers from a nation at total war, with different motivations and expectations. Some had volunteered for Airborne specifically because they wanted elite status. Others had been diverted to Airborne to fill urgent manpower needs. Volunteers in the sense that they chose Airborne over infantry, but not in the sense that jumping from planes was their primary goal. The cultural and regional diversity remained similar: rural Southerners, urban Northerners, farm boys, and factory workers, a cross-section of wartime America. But the shared experience of years of training together, the bonding that had made the original divisions cohesive, didn't exist for the rebuilt units. The leadership challenge was particularly acute for junior officers and non-commissioned officers. A platoon sergeant who had led the same men through training, Sicily and Normandy, now found himself responsible for men he'd known for 2 weeks. His authority was based on rank and combat experience, but he lacked the personal relationships that made men follow leaders into dangerous situations. Some leaders adapted by being more formal and distant, emphasizing rank and military discipline. Others tried to recreate the informality and camaraderie of the original units, learning replacement names and backgrounds quickly. Both approaches had limitations. Formal leadership lacked the personal connection that made paratroopers effective in scattered independent operations. Informal leadership risked favoritism and the emotional trauma of losing men you'd befriended. The successful leaders found a balance, maintaining professional distance while showing genuine concern for their men's welfare. The unsuccessful leaders either couldn't connect with replacements or connected too deeply and broke when those men died. The equipment situation improved significantly during the summer of 1944, though problems remained. The T-7 parachute harness received modifications based on Normandy experience, with reinforced quick-release mechanisms that were less prone to accidental activation. The leg bag system was refined yet again, with better attachment points and simpler release procedures. Weapon scabbards were redesigned with additional padding and more secure mountings, reducing breakaway rates from 40% to approximately 20%. This was improvement, but still meant that 1 in 5 paratroopers would land without their primary weapon. The radio equipment received priority attention, with lighter sets issued to more units and better weatherproofing to prevent saltwater damage during cross-channel operations. None of these improvements solved the fundamental problem that paratroopers carried too much weight and jumped under conditions that equipment couldn't be fully tested for, but they reduced failure rates incrementally. The replacement training at battalion level emphasized night operations and assembly procedures, the critical skills where Normandy had revealed persistent problems. Companies conducted night drops over English countryside, practicing the sequence of landing, shedding parachute, finding rally points, assembling into combat units. The training revealed that replacements made the same mistakes the original volunteers had made in 1941. Poor land navigation, difficulty maintaining noise discipline, hesitation in darkness. The difference was that the replacements had weeks to correct these deficiencies instead of months. Some learned fast enough. Others would learn in combat or die. The officers conducting the training did their best to identify men who weren't ready and remove them from combat assignments, but the pressure to maintain unit strength meant that marginal performers were often kept in the line companies. The alternative would have been acknowledging that the divisions couldn't be rebuilt to full strength in time for the next operation, a political impossibility given strategic commitments. By September 1st, 1944, and the 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions had been nominally restored to full strength through the replacement program. Each division numbered approximately 13,000 men, the authorized strength for airborne divisions. Of those 13,000, approximately 30 to 40% were Normandy veterans. The remainder were replacements with 3 months or less in the Airborne. Some companies had only 3 or 4 veterans from the original D-Day unit. The experience differential was stark. Veterans who had survived 2 or 3 major combat operations, serving alongside men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The divisions were ready for combat, in the sense that they had sufficient manpower and equipment. Whether they were ready in the sense of unit cohesion and combat effectiveness would be determined by the next operation. The planners assumed that veteran leadership would compensate for replacement inexperience, that the airborne culture was strong enough to assimilate new men quickly, and that improved equipment and doctrine would offset the loss of seasoned soldiers. These assumptions were optimistic, but not unreasonable. They would be tested in Holland starting September 17th. The psychological state of veterans preparing for another combat jump was different from their state before Normandy. Before D-Day, there had been anxiety mixed with confidence, fear tempered by the belief that training would see them through. After Normandy, the veterans knew exactly what to expect. Chaos, casualties, missions accomplished through improvisation rather than plan execution. They knew that men would die regardless of skill or preparation, that survival was partially luck, that courage was often just the absence of acceptable alternatives. This knowledge made them more effective soldiers in some ways, more cautious and realistic about risks. It also made them more cynical and fatalistic. Many veterans writing letters home before Market Garden expressed certainty that they would not survive the war, that they had used up their luck in Normandy, that the next jump would be their last. Some were wrong. Others were prophetically correct. The letters held by military postal services to prevent intelligence leaks would be delivered after Market Garden, at reaching families with news of sons or husbands or brothers who had written their own epitaphs. September the 17th, 1944, 1300 hours over Holland. Captain James Taylor sits in the door of a C-47, watching the largest airborne armada in history fill the sky in every direction. 1,544 transport aircraft and 478 gliders fly in perfect formation toward Holland in broad daylight. No clouds, excellent visibility. This is nothing like Sicily or Normandy. The pilots can see the drop zones from miles away. The pathfinders have marked them with smoke and panels. The weather is perfect. Everything that went wrong in previous operations has been corrected. And Taylor feels something he hasn't felt since before Sicily. Confidence that the plan might actually work as written. The green light flashes. Taylor exits into clear afternoon air, his parachute deploying smoothly, and descends toward drop zone T near Grosbeak. He can see other parachutes filling the sky, hundreds of them, a snowfall of silk. He can see the drop zone markers exactly where they're supposed to be. He lands, executes a perfect PLF, sheds his parachute, and assembles his platoon within 10 minutes. 89% of the 82nd Airborne lands on or within 1 mile of their drop zones. The execution is nearly flawless. Taylor allows himself a moment of satisfaction before moving toward his objective. For once, finally, an airborne operation is going according to plan. On Operation Market Garden was the largest and most ambitious airborne operation of the war, an attempt to use vertical envelopment to end the conflict in Europe by Christmas 1944. The strategic concept was elegant. Drop 35,000 Allied airborne troops along a 64-mile corridor in Holland, seize 9 bridges across major rivers and canals, hold them while British armored forces advanced up a single road to link up with each airborne position in sequence, cross the final bridge at Arnhem over the Rhine River, and drive into the industrial Ruhr region of Germany. If successful, Market Garden would bypass the Siegfried Line fortifications, split German forces, and position Allied armies for a rapid advance to Berlin. The plan required perfect execution, optimistic timelines, and German forces that would not react faster than Allied intelligence predicted. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the plan's architect, was confident. American airborne commanders were skeptical but prepared to execute orders. The enlisted men who would actually jump were not consulted about feasibility, only about readiness. They were ready. The question was whether the plan was feasible. The American airborne missions were tactically straightforward and strategically critical. The 101st Airborne would drop at the southern end of the corridor, seize bridges at Eindhoven, Veghel, and other towns, and hold a 15-mile stretch of road called Hell's Highway. The 82nd Airborne would drop in the middle, capture the bridge at Grave, the bridges at Nijmegen including the massive Vaal River Bridge, and hold a 10-mile corridor. British airborne forces would drop at the northern end, capture the bridge at Arnhem, and hold until British armor arrived. The plan called for the ground advance to reach Arnhem within 48 hours. Each airborne division would hold its section of corridor against German counterattacks, resupply by airdrops, and maintain cohesion despite being surrounded. The success of the entire operation depended on every piece working. Accurate drops, successful bridge captures, rapid British armor advance, and German forces that didn't cut the corridor faster than it could be secured. The drops on September 17th were executed with a precision that vindicated 4 years of doctrinal development. The daylight drops allowed pilots to navigate visually to exact coordinates. The Pathfinder teams marked drop zones with colored smoke and ground panels. The 82nd Airborne achieved 89% accuracy, with most men landing on their designated drop zones. The 101st achieved similar results. The equipment losses were minimal compared to Sicily and Normandy. The casualties from the drop itself were light. This was what airborne operations were supposed to look like. Thousands of soldiers arriving exactly where planned, assembling into organized units within minutes, moving to objectives before German forces could respond. The 82nd captured the Grave Bridge intact within hours of landing. Elements of the 101st captured bridges at Sonn and Veghel. The initial phase was succeeding spectacularly, and being proving that the hard lessons of Sicily and Normandy had been learned and applied. Then the plan began to fracture. At Sun, retreating German forces demolished the bridge just before American paratroopers could secure it, forcing a delay while engineers constructed a temporary replacement. At Nijmegen, the Vaal River Bridge was intact but heavily defended, and capturing it would require a coordinated assault that took days to organize. At Arnhem, British paratroopers landed too far from the bridge, encountered unexpectedly strong German resistance, including SS, Panzer divisions that intelligence had missed or underestimated, and found themselves fighting for survival rather than holding a captured objective. Meanwhile, the British armored advance up Hell's Highway proceeded slower than planned, delayed by German resistance, terrain limitations, and the simple fact that moving 30,000 vehicles along a single road required more time than optimistic planners had allocated. The operational timeline began slipping within 24 hours of the first drops. The 82nd Airborne's fight for the Nijmegen bridges illustrated both the courage and the cost of Market Garden. The highway bridge over the Waal River was one of the longest and strongest bridges in Europe, a steel structure capable of supporting heavy armor and absolutely critical to the corridor. German forces held both ends of the bridge with prepared defenses including machine guns, anti-tank guns, and artillery. Direct assault across the bridge would be suicidal. The alternative was to cross the Waal River by boat downstream. Assault the northern end of the bridge from behind while another force assaulted from the south, and capture it intact before Germans could demolish it. This plan required boats which were not immediately available, and soldiers willing to conduct a daylight river crossing under fire, which violated every tactical principle taught in infantry school. The mission was assigned to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. On September 20th, elements of the 504th conducted the Waal River crossing in British assault boats paddled by American paratroopers who had never trained for river operations. The crossing was conducted in daylight across 400 yards of open water, with German machine guns and artillery firing from prepared positions on the north bank. 26 boats launched with approximately 260 men. The first wave suffered 50% casualties before reaching the far shore. The boats were flimsy canvas and wood construction, easily penetrated by bullets. Men paddled with rifles and makeshift oars. Some boats sank in midstream, their occupants drowning or swept away by current. The survivors who reached the north bank assaulted German positions with overwhelming fury, born from rage at their losses. They captured the northern end of the bridge in hand-to-hand fighting that left both sides decimated. Simultaneously, American and British forces assaulted the southern end. The bridge was captured intact. The corridor was maintained. The cost was approximately 200 American casualties in one afternoon for a single objective. The Waal crossing would become one of the most celebrated actions of Market Garden, a tactical success purchased at terrible price. Meanwhile, the 101st Airborne faced a different challenge, holding Hell's Highway against German forces attempting to cut the corridor. The highway was a single two-lane road elevated slightly above surrounding polders, the only route for British armor advancing north. German forces recognized that cutting the highway at any point would isolate Allied forces beyond that point, potentially destroying the entire operation. They attacked Hell's Highway repeatedly with infantry, armor, and artillery, targeting the narrowest sections where one well-placed roadblock could stop the entire advance. The paratroopers holding the corridor found themselves fighting a defensive battle that stretched their resources thin. They had to defend 15 miles of road with approximately 7,000 men, protecting multiple bridges and towns simultaneously while resupplied by airdrops that sometimes landed in German hands. The fighting was continuous, small unit actions where platoons held intersections against company-sized German attacks, mines and ambushes, artillery that bracketed the road with increasing accuracy. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, Medal of Honor recipient from Normandy, was killed by a sniper near Best on September 18th while conducting reconnaissance for an attack. His death illustrated the random nature of combat casualties. One of the most decorated and experienced officers in the Airborne, the survivor of Sicily and Normandy, killed by a single bullet from an unseen enemy. Cole's death deprived the Airborne of exceptional leadership but didn't stop the operation. His battalion continued fighting under new command, taking their objectives, holding their section of corridor. This was the reality of sustained combat. Critical leaders died and were replaced. Missions continued. The operational tempo ground forward regardless of individual losses. Cole's Medal of Honor would be awarded posthumously, presented to his widow at a ceremony he would never attend. He was 29 years old, a career officer who had proven his courage definitively and died anyway. His story was repeated hundreds of times during Market Garden, with less famous men whose deaths were noted in casualty reports and forgotten, except by families who waited for letters that would never come. The failure at Arnhem doomed Market Garden strategically, while the American sectors succeeded tactically. British paratroopers at Arnhem fought desperately for 9 days, surrounded and outnumbered, holding a small perimeter near the bridge while waiting for relief that never arrived. The British armored advance reached Nijmegen, but could not break through to Arnhem against increasing German resistance. On September 25th, the decision was made to evacuate British survivors from Arnhem, abandoning the bridge and the strategic objective of the entire operation. Of approximately 10,000 British paratroopers and glider troops committed at Arnhem, only about 2,400 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The Market Garden plan required capturing and holding all 9 bridges. With Arnhem lost, the corridor ended at Nijmegen, 64 miles short of its objective. The operation had created a salient into German-held territory, but had not achieved the strategic breakthrough that Montgomery promised. The American airborne divisions, despite accomplishing their objectives, suffered significant casualties. The 82nd Airborne lost approximately 1,600 men, killed, wounded, or missing during Market Garden and subsequent operations to hold the corridor. The 101st lost approximately 2,200. These numbers represented approximately 12 to 15% losses, lighter than Normandy, but still substantial. More significantly, the divisions remained in continuous combat through October and into November, defending the corridor against German counterattacks and conducting limited offensive operations. The airborne divisions, once again, were being used as line infantry long after their initial airborne mission was accomplished. The pattern from Normandy repeated: elite troops committed to specialized missions and then held in place for general combat operations, because withdrawing them would create gaps in the line that conventional forces couldn't immediately fill. The strategic assessment of Market Garden has been debated by historians for decades. Montgomery claimed the operation was 90% successful, not having secured crucial bridges and established a salient into Holland. Critics argued that an operation that failed to achieve its primary objective was a failure regardless of partial successes. The American airborne commanders occupied a middle position. Their missions had been accomplished with acceptable casualties and excellent execution. The failure occurred at levels beyond their control, in British sectors and in the overly optimistic operational timeline that couldn't accommodate any friction. General Gavin, who had commanded the 82nd during the operation, later wrote that Market Garden demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of large-scale airborne operations. When executed properly with good weather and adequate intelligence, airborne forces could seize and hold critical objectives. But they could not compensate for flawed strategic planning or unrealistic expectations about conventional force movement rates. The bridge at Arnhem was, as the operation's name suggested in retrospect, a bridge too far. The equipment performance during Market Garden validated the improvements made after Normandy. The parachute malfunction rate remained approximately 1 in 1,000 jumps. The weapons retention rate improved to about 80%, meaning most paratroopers landed with their primary weapons. The radio equipment functioned adequately, allowing coordination between scattered units. The logistics tail worked better than in previous operations, with resupply drops hitting their intended zones more frequently. These incremental improvements didn't eliminate problems, but reduced their frequency and severity. The men who jumped into Holland were better equipped and better prepared than those who jumped into Sicily. That they accomplished their missions with fewer casualties than pessimistic predictions had suggested was testament to both preparation and the courage of soldiers who continued to board aircraft, despite knowing what combat jumps entailed. By late October, when the 82nd and 101st were finally withdrawn from Holland, the strategic situation had changed dramatically from September's optimism. The war would not end in 1944. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German forces, written off as defeated in August, had demonstrated resilience and fighting capability that Allied intelligence had underestimated. The airborne divisions went to France for rest and refitting, once again absorbing replacements to restore combat strength. The veterans of Market Garden joined the veterans of Sicily and Normandy in the ranks of men who had done everything asked of them, accomplished difficult missions under fire, and survived to wonder what the next operation would demand. They had proven that American airborne forces could execute complex operations with precision. They had not proven that those operations could achieve the strategic results that planners promised. That question remained open and would be tested again in December when German forces launched their final desperate offensive in the Ardennes forests of Belgium. The paratroopers who thought they were finished fighting for the year would discover that elite units get no rest, only brief intervals between emergencies. December 18th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. Private First Class. Don Malarkey huddles in a shallow foxhole on the outskirts of Bastogne, watching German forces move through the forest to his front. It's 20 degrees Fahrenheit, overcast, and snowing lightly. Malarkey is wearing a wool uniform designed for spring combat in France, not winter siege in Belgium. He has no winter coat, no gloves adequate for this cold, no boots designed for frozen ground. 2 days ago, he was in Mourmelon, France, on what was supposed to be 3 months of rest after Holland. Then the Germans attacked through the Ardennes, and every available division was rushed forward to stop them. The 101st Airborne loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night and drove through a blizzard to Bastogne, arriving just ahead of German forces converging on the town from 3 directions. Now, Malarkey is dug in with insufficient ammunition, no winter clothing, and orders to hold this position against a German army that outnumbers the defending forces 5-1. A sergeant crawls through the snow to Malarkey's foxhole. "Stay alert. They're probing for weak spots. First attack will probably come at dawn." Malarkey nods, chambering around in his M1. He's out of cigarettes, almost out of food, and completely out of illusions about getting a quiet winter. The war has found him again. The German Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe. 29 German divisions, including elite SS Panzer units. They attacked on December 16th through the lightly defended Ardennes forest sector, hoping to split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise, breaking through American lines and creating a bulge in the Allied front that gave the battle its name. Allied command scrambled to respond, moving forces to contain the breakthrough and prevent German columns from reaching their objectives. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting in France after Market Garden, were among the first units committed to the fight. Both divisions were at approximately 70% strength, still absorbing replacements from Holland casualties, expecting months of training before their next combat operation. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks and sent into Belgium within 48 hours of the German attack. The 101st Airborne received orders to defend Bastogne, a small Belgian town significant only for the road network that ran through it. 7 roads converged at Bastogne, making it the key to controlling movement through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled those roads. The division arrived on December 18, just ahead of German forces closing in from 3 sides. The commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington for meetings and couldn't return in time. Acting command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, a capable officer who had never commanded an infantry division in combat. McAuliffe assessed the situation quickly. 13,000 American soldiers, including the 101st and supporting units, facing approximately 45,000 Germans with armor and artillery advantages. The rational decision might have been to withdraw before being surrounded. McAuliffe's orders were to hold Bastogne. He prepared to be surrounded. The 82nd Airborne deployed north of the German breakthrough, assigned to defend the northern shoulder of the bulge and prevent German forces from widening their penetration. Unlike Bastogne, which became a siege, the 82nd fought fluid defensive battles across frozen forests and snow-covered hills. The weather was the worst in decades, with temperatures dropping below 0 Fahrenheit. It was snow and fog that grounded Allied aircraft and eliminated the air support advantage that American forces usually enjoyed. German and American soldiers fought in conditions that inflicted casualties through exposure as fast as bullets. Frostbite removed hundreds of men from combat on both sides. The cold made weapons malfunction, vehicles fail to start, and wounded men die from shock before they could be evacuated. The 82nd held its positions through determination and the kind of small unit infantry combat where individual soldiers made life or death decisions without orders or supervision. The siege of Bastogne began on December 20th, when German forces completed the encirclement. The 101st and attached units were cut off from friendly forces, surrounded by 4 German divisions. When, with no ground resupply possible and aerial resupply dependent on weather that mostly prevented flying, McAuliffe established a defensive perimeter around the town, assigned sectors to battalions, and waited for the German assault. It came in waves throughout December 21st and 22nd, probing attacks testing for weak points, followed by concentrated assaults against identified positions. The paratroopers held, fighting from hastily dug foxholes and improvised strong points, supplied with only the ammunition they had brought with them. The cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. Men in foxholes suffered frostbite on fingers, toes, and faces. Wounded men froze to death before they could be evacuated. The medical supplies ran low, then critically low, then virtually exhausted. Morphine froze solid and had to be thawed under armpits before it could be injected. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a white flag carrying a surrender demand. The message, addressed to the American commander, offered terms: surrender honorably and be treated well as prisoners, or be destroyed by overwhelming force. McAuliffe's response entered military legend with a single word: nuts. The officers carrying the message didn't understand American slang and had to have it explained that this meant negative. The Americans would not surrender. McAuliffe's actual phrasing was earthier and less quotable, but nuts became the official version and perfectly captured the defiant attitude of the Bastogne defenders. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, and short on everything except determination. Surrender wasn't being considered. The German officers returned with the message. The battle continued. The Christmas Eve airdrop was a desperate gamble that barely succeeded. The weather cleared enough on December 23rd and 24th for Allied transport aircraft to drop supplies to the Bastogne garrison. Pilots flew through anti-aircraft fire and winter storms to drop bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food to defenders who were rationing bullets and operating on wounded men without anesthesia. Not all the drops landed within American lines. Some bundles drifted into German positions. Others landed in no man's land where neither side could safely retrieve them. But enough supplies reached the defenders to continue the fight. The paratroopers who had jumped from aircraft into combat now watched aircraft drop supplies while they fought on the ground, a reversal that would have been ironic if anyone had time to appreciate irony. They gathered the bundles, distributed ammunition and medical supplies, and prepared for the next German attack. The psychological state of the Bastogne defenders was complex and varied by individual. Some men experienced genuine despair, convinced they would die in the frozen Belgian forests far from home. Others embraced fatalism, deciding that since death was probable, they might as well fight well before it came. Many experienced a strange calm that combat veterans often report, the acceptance that they were doing what they had trained to do under the worst possible conditions and that survival was beyond their control. Even the officers worked to maintain morale through small gestures, ensuring that Christmas dinner was served despite the siege, even though the dinner was K rations heated over small fires, organizing religious services, sharing what little good news reached them from outside. The knowledge that American forces were attempting to break through to relieve them sustained hope, though no one knew when or if relief would arrive. The relief came on December 26th when elements of General George Patton's Third Army broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The meeting between tankers and paratroopers was emotional and brief. The siege was lifted, but the battle continued. The 101st, instead of being evacuated, remained in combat to help expand the corridor and push German forces back. 8. The division that had held Bastogne for 7 days under siege would fight for another 3 weeks in continuous combat, conducting offensive operations in the same brutal winter conditions that had characterized the defense. The casualty toll mounted. The division that arrived at Bastogne with 13,000 men would suffer approximately 4,000 casualties before being withdrawn in mid-January. The mathematics of attrition continued grinding elite units into reinforced line infantry. The 82nd Airborne fought continuously from December 18th through January 18th without relief. 32 days of winter combat in defensive and offensive operations. The division held the northern shoulder of the Bulge, preventing German forces from widening the breakthrough toward critical supply routes. There the fighting was small unit infantry combat across frozen terrain, villages changing hands multiple times, neither side able to achieve decisive advantage. The cold caused as many casualties as combat. Trench foot and frostbite removed hundreds of men from effective duty. Weapons froze, vehicles broke down. Artillery shells buried themselves in frozen ground and failed to detonate, reducing the effectiveness of supporting fires. The soldiers adapted by burning diesel fuel in helmets to warm their foxholes, sharing body heat in paired sleeping positions, wrapping weapons in cloth to prevent freezing. The adaptations helped, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem that they were fighting in the worst winter conditions in decades with summer equipment. The casualty statistics from the Ardennes campaign told a story of sustained attrition that destroyed units over time. The 82nd Airborne suffered approximately 3,400 casualties during the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st suffered approximately 4,000. These numbers represented approximately 25 to 30% of effective strength, sustainable only because the divisions received continuous replacement flows. Some companies suffered over 50% casualties, requiring complete reconstitution with new personnel. The veterans who survived Bastogne and the Ardennes fighting joined the ranks of soldiers who had combat experience measured in campaigns rather than battles. Men who had survived Sicily or Normandy or Holland plus the winter fighting, a minority within their own units. The turnover rate meant that by late January 1945, the airborne divisions consisted primarily of men who had joined after D-Day, with a core of veterans from earlier operations providing continuity and leadership. The question of proper employment again arose. Why were elite airborne divisions being used as emergency line infantry for sustained campaigns? The answer was the same as in Normandy: operational necessity. The German offensive created a crisis that required every available combat division. The airborne divisions were available, trained, and theoretically capable of fighting as infantry. The fact that they were designed and equipped for short-duration vertical envelopment operations was irrelevant when the alternative was allowing German forces to break through to Antwerp and potentially split Allied forces. The airborne divisions fought because the situation demanded it, and they continued fighting long after their specialized capabilities were relevant because there was no good time to withdraw elite units while combat continued. The pattern persisted. Airborne operations inserted the divisions behind enemy lines, then conventional operations kept them there until they were essentially indistinguishable from regular infantry, except for their continued pride in being paratroopers. By the end of January 1945, when both airborne divisions were finally withdrawn from Belgium, the strategic situation had stabilized. The German offensive had been contained and reversed. Allied forces were preparing for spring operations to cross the Rhine and drive into Germany. Thus, the airborne divisions went to France for the rest, and refitting that had been interrupted in December. The men who survived the winter fighting were exhausted, cynical, and deeply skeptical of any promises about when the war would end. They had heard in September that the war might be over by Christmas. They had spent Christmas surrounded in Bastogne. Predictions about the war's end were received with dark humor and utter disbelief. The only certainty was that there would be more combat, more casualties, more friends dead, until either Germany surrendered or the survivors ran out of luck. The airborne divisions would make one more combat jump in March 1945, crossing the Rhine in Operation Varsity. For most of the veterans, it would be their last jump. For many, it would be their last battle. The war in Europe would end in May, but the men who survived to see that end would carry the scars of Sicily, Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne for the rest of their lives. March 24th, 1945, 0900 hours, over the Rhine River. Major Paul Smith sits in the lead C-46 Commando, watching the Rhine River approaching. This is different from every previous combat jump. It's daylight, full visibility. Allied fighter aircraft swarm overhead, engaging any German anti-aircraft position that opens fire. British artillery pounds the landing zones with preparatory bombardment. Ground forces have already crossed the Rhine in assault boats and are fighting on the far bank. This is not the vertical envelopment doctrine of dropping behind enemy lines before ground forces arrive. And this is airborne assault used to exploit a breakthrough, dropping in coordination with conventional forces already engaged. Smith appreciates the air cover and the artillery, but he also knows what the German anti-aircraft gunners below appreciate. Perfect visibility means they can see every aircraft clearly, track them accurately, and fire with precision. The anti-aircraft fire begins exactly on cue. Tracers rise toward the formations like strings of deadly beads. Smith watches a C-46 explode 300 yards to his left, flaming debris falling toward the river. The jump master calls, "Stand up! Hook up!" Smith and his men rise, check their equipment, and shuffle toward the door. The green light flashes. Smith jumps into the most intense anti-aircraft fire he's experienced in 4 combat jumps. Below, yes, the ground is already marked with smoke from artillery. Above, the sky is filled with aircraft and parachutes and tracer fire. It's chaos, but it's organized chaos with friendly forces below instead of only enemies. Smith counts to 4, checks his canopy, and prepares for landing. This time, relief will come in hours, not days. Operation Varsity was the final major American airborne operation in Europe, a single-day assault designed to secure bridgeheads across the Rhine River and establish Allied forces on the East Bank. The strategic situation was fundamentally different from earlier operations. By March 1945, Germany was collapsing, squeezed between Allied forces advancing from west and Soviet forces advancing from east. The Rhine represented the last major natural barrier protecting Western Germany. The Allied command planned a massive crossing operation. Conventional forces would assault across the river in boats, engineers would construct bridges under fire, and airborne forces would drop on the far bank to seize high ground, capture bridges over secondary rivers, and prevent German reinforcements from counterattacking the beachhead. The 17th Airborne Division, which had not participated in earlier European operations, and British airborne forces would conduct the assault. The 82nd and 101st remained in reserve, resting after the Ardennes. The 17th would get its chance to prove what later war training and earlier operations lessons could accomplish. The tactical plan for Varsity incorporated every lesson learned from Sicily through Market Garden. Then the drop would occur in daylight with full air superiority, eliminating the navigation problems that plagued night operations. Pathfinders would mark zones but were not solely relied upon, as pilots could navigate visually. The drop would occur after ground forces had already crossed the Rhine, meaning that friendly forces would be available for immediate link-up rather than being days away. The landing zones were within range of Allied artillery, which could provide immediate fire support. Fighter aircraft would suppress German anti-aircraft positions before and during the drop. Gliders carrying heavy equipment would land simultaneously with paratroopers, avoiding the equipment dispersion problems of previous operations. The operation was designed for rapid execution and quick relief, as a sharp contrast to the extended isolation of Normandy or Bastogne. The execution demonstrated both the improvements in airborne capability and the persistent danger of combat jumps. The 17th Airborne dropped 9,387 men in a single lift, the largest American airborne operation delivered in one wave. Approximately 89% landed within their designated drop zones, validating the daylight precision drops. The assembly was rapid, with most units organized and moving to objectives within 30 minutes. But the German anti-aircraft fire was the heaviest of any airborne operation in the war. The Germans, knowing the attack was coming and unable to prevent the ground crossing, concentrated every available anti-aircraft gun on the drop zones. The result was devastating for the transport aircraft. 72 C-46 and C-47 aircraft were shot down during the operation. 332 more were damaged, many so severely they never flew again. The aircrew casualties exceeded 400 killed and wounded, the highest loss rate for any airborne operation. The glider operations at Varsity were simultaneously successful in delivery and catastrophic in casualties. Over 200 gliders carrying troops, jeeps, and artillery pieces crash-landed in designated zones. The gliders delivered their cargo successfully, but the landing process was violently destructive. Gliders hitting the ground at high speed would break apart on impact, ejecting their occupants, crushing equipment, killing and injuring soldiers before they could engage the enemy. Indeed, the glider infantry casualty rate from landing impacts was approximately 15%, meaning that 1 in 7 glider soldiers was killed or injured in the landing itself. This was better than Sicily's 40% glider destruction rate, but still represented a fundamental problem. Gliders could deliver men and equipment together, but couldn't do so safely. The Varsity operation would be the last large-scale combat glider operation in American military history, as the losses convinced commanders that helicopters would eventually provide a better solution for delivering troops and equipment to contested landing zones. The ground objectives for the 17th Airborne were accomplished with remarkable speed. The division's mission was to seize high ground overlooking the Rhine, capture bridges over the Isle River to prevent their demolition, and hold until relieved by advancing British ground forces. All objectives were secured within 6 hours of the drop. The link-up with British forces occurred by mid-afternoon, far faster than any previous airborne operation. The rapid success validated the concept of using airborne forces to exploit conventional breakthroughs, rather than creating isolated enclaves behind enemy lines. The casualties were significant but sustainable. Approximately 1,346 killed and wounded from 9,000 committed, a 15% loss rate concentrated in the first day. This compared favorably to Normandy's 11% in the first 24 hours, but worse than Market Garden's initial light casualties. Then the difference was that Varsity was designed as a one-day operation, and by nightfall, the division was linked up with friendly forces rather than isolated. The strategic impact of Varsity was limited by the operational context. Germany was already collapsing by March 1945, and the Rhine crossing would have succeeded with or without the airborne component. The operation's significance was more demonstrative than decisive. It proved that American and British forces had mastered the technical and tactical challenges of large-scale airborne assault. It showed that with adequate preparation, air superiority, and coordination with ground forces, airborne operations could achieve their objectives with acceptable casualties. But it also demonstrated the persistent cost of vertical envelopment. 72 aircraft lost, hundreds of aircrew casualties, 1,300 ground casualties, and significant equipment destruction, all for objectives that conventional forces would have reached within 24 hours anyway. The question raised by Varsity was whether the airborne capability was worth maintaining in its current form, or whether future developments, such as helicopters, would provide better solutions. The technical innovations displayed at Varsity showed how far airborne capability had evolved since the experimental test platoon of 1940. The transport aircraft, primarily C-46 Commandos, were specialized for paratrooper drops with improved static line systems and larger cargo doors. The parachutes were refined versions of the T-5 with lower malfunction rates. The equipment delivery systems worked more reliably. The radio communications allowed coordination between scattered units. The Pathfinder techniques guided formations to precise coordinates. The joint training between air and ground units produced smooth execution despite complexity. These were incremental improvements accumulated over 5 years of development and combat experience. They made airborne operations feasible at scale, though they could not eliminate the fundamental risks of dropping soldiers from aircraft into hostile territory. The personal experiences of 17th Airborne soldiers at Varsity illustrated the persistent gap between improved doctrine and combat reality. Private James Morton landed in his designated drop zone, executed a perfect parachute landing fall, and assembled with his squad within 5 minutes, exactly according to plan. Elaine, then his squad leader, was killed by machine gun fire while moving toward their objective. Morton, a replacement who had joined the division 3 months earlier, found himself leading the squad because he was the senior surviving soldier. He had never led men in combat. He had memorized the objective on a map, but had no detailed knowledge of the terrain. He made his best guess about how to proceed, led the squad forward, and accomplished the mission through combination of training and luck. His experience was typical. Operations proceeded generally according to plan at the macro level, while devolving into improvisation and chaos at the tactical level. The success of airborne operations depended less on plans surviving contact with the enemy than on having soldiers capable of functioning when plans inevitably broke down. The casualties from anti-aircraft fire at Varsity created posthumous debates about whether the operation justified the cost. 72 aircraft and 400 aircrew were substantial losses for a single day's operation. The ground casualties of 1,300 men were significant, though not catastrophic. The question was whether dropping 9,000 soldiers behind enemy lines to seize objectives that ground forces reached within hours was worth losing 72 aircraft and nearly 2,000 total casualties. Commanders who supported airborne operations argued that the rapid seizure of objectives prevented German demolition of bridges and saved time in the overall advance. Critics argued that the same results could have been achieved with conventional forces at lower cost. Both positions had merit, and the debate was never resolved. What was certain was that Varsity demonstrated the capability to conduct large-scale airborne operations with precision and coordination that would have seemed impossible in 1943. Whether that capability remained relevant in the evolving nature of warfare was a question for future conflicts. The airborne soldiers who participated in Varsity and survived became the last generation of World War II American paratroopers to make combat jumps in Europe. For the 17th Airborne, it was their first and only combat jump. For the veterans of earlier operations who participated, it was validation that their sacrifices in Sicily and Normandy had led to doctrine and capabilities that worked. The war in Europe would end 6 weeks later, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The airborne divisions would be posted to occupation duties or redeployed to prepare for the invasion of Japan that never occurred. The men who jumped at Varsity carried forward the tradition established by the Test Platoon Volunteers of 1940. American soldiers willing to exit aircraft over hostile territory, accept the risks, and accomplish missions that conventional forces could not. The question of whether those missions should be assigned to paratroopers or accomplished by other means would be debated for decades. The men who made the jumps didn't participate in those debates. They had done what was asked of them, survived or died accordingly, and earned their place in the history of American airborne warfare. February 3, 1945, 0830 hours, over Corregidor Island, Philippines. Lieutenant George Jones stands in the door of a C-47, staring down at Corregidor with a mixture of determination and horror. The island is a rock fortress in Manila Bay, 2 miles long and half a mile wide, shaped like a tadpole with sheer cliffs on most sides. The Japanese have held it for 3 years, fortifying it with tunnels, bunkers, and gun positions. The American plan is to drop paratroopers on top of the island on an area called topside that measures approximately 300 yards by 700 yards. That's the size of 7 football fields, surrounded by cliffs with ocean beyond. If Jones misses the drop zone, he'll land on cliffs, in ocean, or in Japanese positions below. The margin for error is 0. The jump master calls, "Go!" Jones exits at 400 feet, half the normal jump altitude. Nay, because higher altitude would scatter men off the island. His parachute deploys violently. He has perhaps 15 seconds of descent. Below, he can see other paratroopers landing on topside, some hitting the ground, some tangling in the ruins of buildings, some disappearing over the cliffs. Jones hits the ground hard, right at the edge of the drop zone. He rolls, comes up 15 feet from the cliff edge, and realizes he just survived the most dangerous jump in airborne history. Then the Japanese mortars start firing, and he realizes survival was temporary. The Pacific Theater airborne operations remain largely unknown compared to European operations, overshadowed by the larger scale and higher profile of D-Day and Market Garden. But the paratroopers who fought in the Pacific conducted some of the most technically difficult and strategically significant airborne operations of the war. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment and the 11th Airborne Division fought across the Pacific from New Guinea to the Philippines, conducting 4 combat jumps and numerous conventional infantry operations in jungle and island terrain that was completely different from European bocage. The Pacific paratroopers developed different tactics, faced different enemies, and operated under different strategic constraints. Their story is essential to understanding the full scope of American airborne operations in World War II. The first combat jump in the Pacific occurred on June 23, 1944, when elements of the 503rd PIR dropped onto Biak Island in Dutch New Guinea. The mission was to support ground forces stalled by Japanese defenders holding cave positions in cliffs. The drop zone was a small clearing surrounded by jungle, requiring precision navigation and timing. The execution was complicated by tropical weather, unfamiliar terrain, and limited intelligence about Japanese positions. The drop succeeded in delivering approximately 800 paratroopers to the objective area, but the subsequent fighting demonstrated that jungle operations required different tactics than European combat. The dense vegetation limited visibility to meters rather than hundreds of yards. Japanese defenders fought from concealed positions in caves and bunkers that were nearly impossible to locate until they opened fire. The paratroopers adapted by using flamethrowers and explosives to clear bunkers, calling in close air support to attack cave positions, and conducting small unit patrols that methodically cleared terrain. The operation succeeded, but revealed that Pacific combat would be as much about adapting to terrain as defeating the enemy. The Corregidor operation in February 1945 was the most technically challenging airborne assault of the war. Corregidor Island had been the last American holdout in the Philippines when Japan invaded in 1942. General Douglas MacArthur had vowed to return, and recapturing Corregidor was both strategically valuable and symbolically important. The island was heavily fortified with Japanese defenders in underground tunnel complexes that made them nearly immune to conventional bombardment. The American plan called for a combined paratrooper and amphibious assault. The 503rd PIR would drop on topside, the highest point of the island, while infantry would assault from the sea. The drop zone on topside was terrifyingly small, surrounded by cliffs and ocean. Missing the zone meant death. The plan called for dropping at 400 feet altitude to minimize drift, half the normal combat jump altitude, and low enough that reserve parachutes would be useless if the main parachute malfunctioned. The execution of the Corregidor drop on February 3rd demonstrated extraordinary courage and acceptance of risk. 2 battalion combat teams, approximately 2,000 men, jumped in multiple waves throughout the day. The low altitude meant parachutes opened violently, and descent was brief, giving jumpers almost no time to prepare for landing. The small drop zone meant collisions were common, with paratroopers landing on each other, tangling parachutes, hitting ruins and debris from previous bombardment. Approximately 25% of the jumpers were injured during the landing itself, before engaging Japanese forces. Some men landed on cliffs and fell to their deaths. Others landed in the ocean and drowned. Some were blown off course and landed in Japanese-held areas, where they were killed before they could orient themselves. The 503rd suffered approximately 225 casualties from landing injuries alone, the highest percentage of jump-related casualties in any American airborne operation. The fighting on Corregidor lasted 11 days and was characterized by close combat in underground tunnels and bunker complexes. The Japanese defenders, approximately 5,000 men, had prepared Corregidor for extended defense. The tunnel systems were extensive, with ammunition stores, food, water, and defensive positions throughout. The Americans used demolitions to seal tunnels, pumped gasoline into bunkers and ignited it, and fought hand-to-hand when Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden entrances. On February 21st, a massive explosion devastated part of topside when ammunition stored in underground chambers detonated, possibly triggered by American demolitions or possibly by Japanese suicide action. The explosion killed approximately 200 soldiers from both sides and created a crater visible from miles away. The survivors continued fighting. Corregidor was declared secured on February 26th, but small groups of Japanese continued resisting for weeks. The American casualties totaled approximately 500 killed and wounded from 2,000 committed, a 25% loss rate that exceeded most European operations. The Los Baños raid on February 23, 1945, demonstrated the precision and planning capability that Pacific Airborne forces had developed. Los Baños was a Japanese prisoner of war camp, holding approximately 2,100 Allied prisoners, mostly civilians, in deteriorating conditions with minimal food and medical care. Intelligence indicated the Japanese might massacre the prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. Next, the 11th Airborne Division planned a raid to rescue the prisoners before that could occur. The operation required extraordinary coordination. Paratroopers would drop directly into the camp at dawn, guerrilla forces would attack Japanese guards from outside, amphibious forces would cross a lake to evacuate prisoners, and all three elements had to arrive simultaneously for the plan to work. Any delay or miscommunication would result in the deaths of prisoners the raid was intended to save. The Los Baños raid executed with nearly perfect precision. At 0700 hours on February 23rd, paratroopers from the 511th PIR dropped directly into the Los Baños camp, while guerrillas attacked from the perimeter, and amphibious forces arrived at the lake shore. The Japanese guards were surprised and overwhelmed within minutes. The prisoners, many of whom were starving and ill, were evacuated to waiting amphibious vehicles. The entire operation, from first shots fired to last prisoners evacuated, took approximately 2 hours. All 214 prisoners were rescued. Only 2 Allied soldiers were killed. 243 Japanese guards were killed. The raid was considered one of the most successful rescue operations in military history, demonstrating what airborne forces could accomplish when used for surgical strikes on specific targets rather than large-scale envelopment operations. The contrast with Corregidor was stark. At Los Baños, precision planning and execution produced minimal casualties and complete success. At Corregidor, or brute force application in terrible terrain produced high casualties and eventual success. Both were valid uses of airborne capability, but suggested very different doctrinal futures. The Pacific paratroopers developed tactics and techniques that differed significantly from European doctrine. Jungle operations required small unit actions with limited visibility and minimal supporting fires. The terrain prevented the kind of massed artillery support common in Europe. Air support was critical but difficult to coordinate when calling strikes on positions 30 yards from friendly troops through dense jungle canopy. The Pacific paratroopers became experts in close combat, using grenades, flamethrowers, and explosives more frequently than in European operations. They learned to navigate by compass through jungle where landmarks were invisible. They adapted to tropical diseases, unfamiliar foods, and climate conditions that ranged from monsoon rains to oppressive heat. The combat was no less intense than Europe, but was fought in smaller unit sizes across more dispersed terrain. A company-sized action in the Pacific might cover several square miles of jungle, whereas the same size unit in Europe might fight for control of a single village. The strategic contribution of Pacific airborne operations was disproportionate to the numbers involved. The 503rd PIR and 11th Airborne Division numbered approximately 15,000 men total, a fraction of the airborne forces committed in Europe. But they operated in a theater where maneuver was constrained by geography, and every island required separate amphibious assault. Meant the ability to drop forces directly onto objectives, bypassing beach defenses and seizing key terrain, provided operational flexibility that conventional forces lacked. The Los Baños raid rescued over 2,000 prisoners with minimal casualties. The Corregidor operation recaptured a symbol of American resistance and secured Manila Bay. These were accomplishments that justified the specialized training and equipment that airborne forces required, even in a theater where large-scale airborne operations were impractical due to distances and limited aircraft availability. The question of why Pacific airborne operations remain relatively unknown compared to European operations has multiple answers. First, the scale was smaller, thousands of paratroopers in the Pacific versus tens of thousands in Europe. Second, among the European operations occurred at critical moments of widely publicized campaigns like D-Day and Market Garden, while Pacific operations occurred in the context of island-hopping campaigns where each individual action was one of many. Third, the public narrative of the war focused on Europe as the primary theater where American forces fought alongside British and Soviet allies, while the Pacific was characterized as primarily an American campaign with less Allied participation. The result was that Corregidor and Los Baños received brief attention and then faded from popular memory, while Normandy and Bastogne became enduring parts of American military culture. The men who jumped in the Pacific knew their operations were as difficult and as significant as European operations. History has been slower to acknowledge that fact. By mid-1945, both European and Pacific airborne forces were preparing for the invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1945. The planning called for massive airborne operations to seize airfields and key terrain on Kyushu, the southern Japanese home island. The casualty predictions were catastrophic. Planners estimated 70% casualties in the first 3 days for airborne units, assuming fanatical Japanese resistance and civilian participation in defense. The paratroopers preparing for Olympic knew these estimates and prepared accordingly, writing final letters, settling affairs, and accepting that the invasion of Japan would probably kill most of them. That the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August and the subsequent Japanese surrender saved the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers, including most of the airborne forces who would have jumped into Japan. The paratroopers who survived the war went home, knowing they had been spared a fate that planning documents suggested was nearly certain death. That knowledge colored their entire post-war experience, a sense that they were living on borrowed time, gifted by atomic weapons they barely understood. June 15, 1945, Pentagon, Washington, D.C. A statistician named Margaret Chen sits in a windowless office compiling final casualty figures for American airborne operations in World War II. The numbers spread across her desk tell a story of blood and courage measured in percentages and totals. It's 82nd. Airborne Division, 442 days in combat, 8,010 casualties, 34% of all men who served in the division during the war. 101st Airborne Division, 241 days in combat, 10,095 casualties, approximately 40% of all men who served. 17th Airborne Division, 115 days in combat, 3,315 casualties, 28%. 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 15 months in Pacific combat, over 1,800 casualties. Chen knows these aren't just numbers. Each casualty represents a young man, most in their early 20s, who volunteered for duty that carried higher risks than conventional infantry. Each casualty is a family receiving notification, then a mother or wife or child learning that their soldier was killed or wounded while jumping from an aircraft into enemy territory. Chen types the summary. Airborne forces suffered disproportionately high casualty rates compared to standard infantry divisions, with overall losses approximately 35 to 40% compared to 22% for conventional divisions. She pauses, considering adding commentary about whether these losses were justified by operational results. She decides against it. The numbers speak clearly enough on their own. The statistical analysis of American airborne operations in World War II reveals patterns that illuminate the true cost of vertical envelopment. Across all theaters and operations, American airborne forces conducted 8 major combat jumps: Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, southern France, while Market Garden, varsity in Europe, plus Biak, Corregidor, Nadzab, and Los Baños in the Pacific. Approximately 65,000 American soldiers qualified as paratroopers during the war. Of these, approximately 17,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The casualty rate of 26% was calculated across all airborne qualified soldiers, including those who never saw combat. For soldiers who actually participated in combat operations, the casualty rate exceeded 40%. This compared to approximately 22% for conventional infantry divisions, already high by any standard. The airborne casualty rate was nearly double that of regular infantry, validating the perception that volunteering for paratrooper duty meant accepting significantly higher risk of death or injury. The distribution of casualties reveals important patterns about when and how paratroopers died. Approximately 15% of all airborne casualties occurred during the jump itself or in the first hour after landing. Parachute malfunctions, landing injuries, drowning in flooded areas, being killed before assembly. Another 25% occurred in the first 24 hours after landing, during the chaotic period when scattered units were assembling and moving to objectives. The remaining 60% occurred during sustained combat operations that followed the initial airborne insertion. This distribution demonstrates that the jump itself, while dangerous, was less lethal than the subsequent combat. The majority of airborne soldiers who died were killed fighting as infantry after successfully completing their parachute assault. This reality complicated the narrative of airborne operations. The paratroopers were not dying primarily because they jumped from planes, but because they fought as outnumbered infantry, often surrounded, always supplied inadequately against prepared enemy positions. The Medal of Honor statistics tell their own story about airborne courage and cost. 87 American soldiers from airborne units received the Medal of Honor during World War II, representing approximately 6% of all Medals of Honor awarded in the European and Pacific theaters. Given that airborne forces represented less than 2% of total American forces deployed, this 6% representation was disproportionately high. Many of the citations reveal common patterns: soldiers exposing themselves to enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades, leading assaults against overwhelming odds, holding positions despite being surrounded and outnumbered, making sacrifices that allowed their units to accomplish missions. Reading the citations chronologically from Sicily through varsity shows an evolution from individual heroism in chaotic situations to coordinated small unit actions that reflected improved training and doctrine. The early citations describe desperate improvisation. The later citations describe calculated risks taken by soldiers who understood their tactical situation and chose courage over survival. The German assessment of American airborne forces provides external validation of their effectiveness. Post-war interrogations of German commanders consistently reference the psychological impact of airborne operations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated that the Normandy airborne drops, despite their scatter, created confusion that delayed German response to the beach landings by critical hours. General Kurt Student, commander of German airborne forces, praised American paratrooper aggressiveness while criticizing their tendency to remain in sustained combat, rather than withdrawing after completing initial objectives. German tactical documents captured during the war showed that units facing American paratroopers were instructed to assume numerical superiority even when outnumbering the Americans, as because scattered paratroopers fighting independently were considered more dangerous than equivalent numbers of conventional infantry operating under centralized command. This assessment suggests that the airborne training emphasis on independent action and initiative created tactical advantages that partially offset the disadvantages of dispersion and light armament. The question of strategic value versus human cost was debated extensively in post-war assessments. Proponents of airborne operations argued that missions like securing the causeways at Normandy or holding Bastogne could not have been accomplished by conventional forces in the same time frame, therefore justifying the specialized training and higher casualties. And critics argued that most airborne objectives could have been reached by conventional forces with slightly longer timelines and lower overall casualties, making the airborne capability an expensive luxury rather than a necessity. Both positions had supporting evidence. Normandy airborne operations clearly facilitated the beach landings, though whether the landings would have failed without airborne support remains unknowable counterfactual. Market Garden demonstrated that even successful tactical execution couldn't overcome flawed strategic planning. The debate was never resolved because it depends on assumptions about what would have happened in alternative scenarios that were never executed. The long-term physical and psychological costs to survivors were never adequately quantified, but were substantial. The cumulative effect of multiple parachute jumps, hard landings, and combat stress created chronic health problems for many veterans. Back injuries, knee damage, and joint problems plagued former paratroopers decades after the war. The psychological trauma of combat was compounded by the particular stresses of airborne operations. The helplessness during descent under fire, the isolation of scattered landings, the intensity of fighting while surrounded. Many veterans developed what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty with civilian life. The support systems for addressing these issues were minimal in the 1940s and 50s. Veterans were expected to readjust to civilian life without complaint. Many did, carrying their trauma privately. All others struggled with alcoholism, failed relationships, and inability to maintain employment. The human cost of airborne operations extended far beyond the casualty statistics compiled during the war. The comparison between airborne divisions and conventional infantry divisions illuminates the trade-offs inherent in specialized forces. An airborne division cost approximately 50% more to train and equip than a conventional infantry division, required more time to build combat effectiveness, and suffered higher casualties in combat. In exchange, the airborne division could conduct operations that conventional divisions could not. Rapid deployment by air to distant objectives, vertical envelopment behind enemy defenses, seizure of key terrain before enemy forces could respond. Whether this trade-off was favorable depended on strategic context. In situations where rapid deployment was critical, airborne forces were invaluable. In sustained combat where their specialized capabilities were irrelevant, they were expensive infantry. The challenge for military planners was that predicting which situations would arise was difficult, and maintaining specialized capabilities required continuous investment, regardless of whether they were currently being employed. The racial integration question remained unresolved throughout the war, and represented a significant limitation on airborne potential. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the only black paratrooper unit to see combat in World War II, was not activated until late 1943 and did not deploy to Europe until late 1944. The soldiers of the 555th trained to the same standards as white paratroopers, qualified at the same rates, and fought effectively in combat in Italy and France. Yet they were never integrated into the larger airborne divisions and were employed separately, typically assigned to less critical missions. This was not a reflection on their capability, but on the racist policies of the military establishment. The exclusion of qualified black soldiers from most airborne units throughout the war represented a waste of human potential and a moral failure. The 555th proved that black soldiers could perform as well as white soldiers in elite units, on the lesson that would eventually contribute to military integration in the late 1940s. But the opportunity lost during World War II was never recovered. The post-war Air Force assessment of airborne operations focused heavily on aircraft losses and crew casualties. 143 transport aircraft were lost during combat airborne operations in Europe and the Pacific, with crew casualties exceeding 1,000 killed and wounded. These losses represented approximately 10% of all transport aircraft committed to airborne operations, a rate that Air Force planners considered barely sustainable and only justified by the strategic importance of specific operations. The aircraft losses at Varsity, 72 planes shot down in one day, prompted serious questions about whether future airborne operations could be conducted against opponents with effective anti-aircraft defenses. The assessment concluded that large-scale combat jumps would become increasingly difficult as anti-aircraft technology improved, suggesting that the golden age of parachute assault might already be ending, even as the war concluded. The ultimate assessment of American airborne operations in World War II must acknowledge both exceptional achievement and significant costs. The paratroopers accomplished missions that were critical to Allied victory. they seized and held objectives that conventional forces could not have reached in time. They demonstrated courage and adaptability under the most difficult combat conditions. They created a culture of elite military service that influenced American special operations for generations. But they paid for these accomplishments with casualty rates that exceeded conventional forces, with physical and psychological trauma that lasted lifetimes, with families destroyed by deaths that statistics reduced to percentages. The question of whether the price was worth paying has no objective answer. For the men who volunteered, made their jumps, and survived, the price was their own to pay. For the nation that sent them into combat, the judgment depends on values that differ between individuals and change across time. What remains beyond debate is that the price was high, the courage was real, and the legacy endures. May 8, 2024, Fort Benning, Georgia. It's a young private named Marcus Johnson stands in formation on the same parade ground where the test platoon assembled in 1940. It's his graduation day from Airborne school, the completion of 3 weeks of training that follows a curriculum largely unchanged in structure from 84 years ago. Ground Week, Tower Week, Jump Week, culminating in 5 qualifying jumps that earn the silver wings Johnson will receive in 10 minutes. The ceremony is brief and traditional. The commandant calls names alphabetically. Each graduate steps forward. The commandant pins the parachutist badge to their uniform over the left breast pocket, exactly where it's been worn since Lieutenant Yarborough designed it in 1941. Johnson feels the pins press through his uniform. The commandant steps back and salutes. Johnson salutes in return and rejoins formation. He is now a paratrooper, part of a tradition that stretches back to men who jumped into Sicily with untested equipment and imperfect doctrine. Johnson knows the history and outline: Normandy, Bastogne, Market Garden, names that echo through airborne culture. What he doesn't fully understand yet is that he's joined not just a military occupational specialty, but a brotherhood defined by willingness to exit aircraft in flight. A small percentage of people who have done something most humans instinctively refuse to do. The wings on his chest mark him as different, elite, part of something larger than himself. Whether that difference matters in modern warfare is debatable. Whether it matters to the men who wear the wings is not. The Airborne School at Fort Benning has operated continuously since 1940, training over 1.5 million American soldiers in parachute operations across 8 decades. The basic training structure remains remarkably consistent, with the program developed during World War II: physical conditioning, exit training from mock doors and towers, parachute landing fall practice, and 5 qualifying jumps from aircraft. The equipment has evolved, with modern parachutes offering better reliability and control than the T-5. The aircraft have changed from C-47s to C-130s and C-17s. But the fundamental experience of standing in the door of an aircraft and stepping into empty air remains essentially unchanged. Every soldier who graduates airborne school in the 21st century experiences the same fear, all the same adrenaline, the same relief upon landing that the test platoon experienced in 1940. That continuity of experience creates a connection across generations of paratroopers that is emotionally powerful even when tactically irrelevant. The combat utility of mass parachute assault declined rapidly after World War II and became essentially obsolete by the late 20th century. The last large-scale American combat jump was Operation Just Cause in Panama, December 1989, when elements of the 75th Ranger Regiment and 82nd Airborne Division conducted parachute assaults to seize airports and key installations. The operation succeeded tactically, but demonstrated that modern anti-aircraft systems made large formation drops increasingly dangerous. Since then, all American airborne operations have been primarily administrative, using parachutes to insert special operations forces in small numbers, or to resupply remote positions. The kind of mass drops that characterized World War II, with thousands of paratroopers exiting hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves, have not occurred in American combat operations for over 3 decades. The capability remains in theory, with the 82nd Airborne Division maintaining readiness to conduct parachute assaults, but the practical opportunities have evaporated as warfare evolved. The cultural legacy of World War II paratroopers far exceeds their tactical relevance in modern warfare. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions remain active-duty units in the U.S. Army, all considered elite even though neither has conducted a combat parachute assault in decades. The divisions deploy regularly to combat zones, but fight primarily as light infantry transported by helicopter or ground vehicle. Their airborne qualification is maintained through periodic training jumps, but the division's combat effectiveness derives from infantry skills, not parachuting capability. Yet the airborne identity remains central to their culture. Soldiers in these divisions take pride in wearing jump wings, in belonging to units with World War II lineage, in maintaining standards that trace back to the original volunteers. This cultural continuity serves organizational purposes, creating unit cohesion and esprit de corps that can be tactically valuable even when the specific capability that created the culture is rarely employed. The influence of airborne culture on American special operations is direct and profound. Every modern special operations unit, Rangers, Special Forces, SEALs, Delta Force, requires or strongly encourages airborne qualification. The connection is partially practical. Special operations sometimes requires parachute infiltration to remote locations, but the connection is primarily cultural. Airborne training serves as a filter that identifies soldiers willing to accept risk and discomfort in pursuit of elite status. The physical demands and psychological stress of learning to parachute eliminate soldiers who lack the mental toughness that special operations requires. Airborne qualification has become a prerequisite not because special operations soldiers frequently jump from planes, but because the willingness to jump from planes correlates with other attributes that special operations values. This use of airborne training as a selection mechanism traces directly to World War II, when the volunteer paratrooper program created a self-selected population with specific psychological characteristics. The modern special operations community is, in many ways, the direct descendant of that selection process. The question of whether modern airborne capability justifies its cost is debated within military planning circles with no consensus. Maintaining the 82nd Airborne Division's parachute capability requires dedicated aircraft, specialized equipment, regular training jumps that cause injuries, and significant financial investment. The capability is rarely employed in combat. Its critics argue that the same resources could provide better return if invested in helicopter assault capabilities, unmanned systems, or additional conventional forces. Defenders argue that the capability provides strategic options that would not exist otherwise, that the low employment rate reflects successful deterrence rather than capability irrelevance, and that the cultural benefits of maintaining elite airborne units justify costs beyond tactical utility. Both arguments have merit, and the resolution depends on assumptions about future conflicts and the value assigned to intangible factors like tradition and military culture. The veteran population of World War II airborne soldiers has largely passed away, with only a small percentage surviving into the 2020s. The living veterans are in their late 90s or older, and memories fading, bodies bearing the accumulated damage of hard landings and combat injuries. Their stories are being documented by historians and oral history projects attempting to preserve first-hand accounts before they're lost. These efforts have revealed consistent themes: pride in service, emphasis on unit cohesion and brotherhood, reluctance to discuss traumatic events, and mixed feelings about whether the costs were justified. Many veterans, when asked if they would volunteer again knowing what they know now, pause for long moments before answering. Some say yes without hesitation, that the experience defined their lives and they have no regrets. Others say they would volunteer again because it was their duty, but they would not want their children or grandchildren to experience what they experienced. The nuanced answers resist simple narratives of heroism or tragedy, suggesting that the airborne experience in World War II was complex, meaningful, and costly in ways that cannot be reduced to statistics or celebrations. The physical artifacts of World War II airborne operations are preserved in museums and memorials across the United States and Europe. Fort Benning maintains the National Infantry Museum with extensive airborne exhibits, including original equipment, photographs, and personal stories. The Airborne Museum in Sainte-Mère-Église, France, occupies a building near the church where Private John Steele hung from his parachute on D-Day. The museum displays equipment, documents, and testimonies from American and German soldiers who fought in Normandy. These institutions serve educational purposes, but also function as shrines, nay, places where veterans and their families can connect with history and honor sacrifices. The museums struggle with how to present airborne operations honestly, acknowledging both the courage and the costs, without either glorifying war or dishonoring those who fought. The balance is difficult and never perfect, but the attempt reflects genuine effort to preserve complex truths rather than simple myths. The cultural representation of airborne forces in American media has evolved from World War II propaganda to more nuanced modern portrayals. Early representations like the 1949 film Battleground presented paratroopers as heroic figures accomplishing difficult missions through courage and determination. Later, works like Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers and the subsequent HBO series attempted more complex portrayals that acknowledged fear, casualties, and moral ambiguity alongside traditional narratives of heroism. These representations have shaped public understanding of airborne operations, creating cultural touchstones that most Americans recognize even if they know little about military history. The danger is that cultural representations can simplify complex realities, creating myths that obscure the costs and complications of actual combat. But the benefit is that they keep the history alive for generations who have no direct connection to World War II, ensuring that the sacrifices are remembered even if the details are sometimes distorted. And the philosophical question underlying the entire airborne legacy is whether specialized elite units enhance military effectiveness or simply redistribute capability at higher cost. The argument for elite units is that concentration of superior soldiers with specialized training creates capabilities that cannot be achieved through conventional organization. The argument against is that elite units create hierarchy and resentment within the military, drain the best soldiers from conventional units that still have important missions, and create expectations of employment that may not match strategic reality. World War II airborne operations provide evidence for both arguments. The missions accomplished by paratroopers in Normandy and elsewhere justified their existence and validated the specialized training. But the repeated misuse of airborne divisions as conventional infantry suggests that the capability was not well understood or properly employed by higher command. The legacy is therefore mixed, proof that elite units can accomplish unique missions, but also warning that creating such units does not guarantee they will be used appropriately. The enduring symbol of American airborne forces remains the jump wings, the silver parachute and wings badge that has been worn essentially unchanged since World War II. Over 1.5 million Americans have earned those wings across 84 years. Most earned them through the 5 qualifying jumps at airborne school and never jumped again, their wings representing a brief phase of military service rather than a career specialty. Others earned them and continued jumping for years or decades, making hundreds of jumps in training and the occasional combat operation. A small percentage earned them and jumped into combat in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Afghanistan, or Iraq, their wings representing not just qualification, but proven courage under fire. The wings make no distinction between these categories. A private fresh from airborne school wears the same badge as a combat veteran with 100 jumps. This democracy of symbolism reflects the fundamental airborne principle. Everyone who exits an aircraft in flight accepts the same basic risk, regardless of how many times they've done it before. The wings represent that acceptance of risk, that willingness to step into empty air when every instinct screams to stay inside the aircraft. The final assessment of American paratroopers in World War II must acknowledge paradox. They were elite soldiers trained for specialized missions who spent most of their combat time fighting as conventional infantry. They were volunteers seeking glory who found themselves in sustained combat that was grinding and unglamorous. They accomplished missions that were critical to Allied victory, while suffering casualty rates that raise questions about whether the cost was justified. They created a military culture that persists decades after the tactical capability it celebrated became largely obsolete. They were men who did something extraordinary, jumping from aircraft into enemy territory in darkness and chaos, and then did something ordinary, fighting as infantry soldiers through hedgerows and forests and towns. Bleeding and dying much like other soldiers and other units. Their legacy is not a simple story of heroism or tragedy, but a complex truth about courage, cost, adaptation, and the gap between theoretical capability and operational reality. The wings they earned represent not just the jumps they made, but the willingness to continue fighting after landing, to accomplish missions despite scattering and casualties, to remain effective when plans dissolved into chaos. That combination of specialized skill and general toughness, of elite identity and common sacrifice, defines the American paratrooper legacy from 1940 to the present. The badge remains unchanged. The men who earn it continue to step into the door, as soldiers have for over 80 years, accepting risk in service of mission, carrying forward a tradition built on the broken bones and spilled blood of volunteers who wanted to know if they were brave enough and discovered the answer one jump at a time.